Hey, Sovereign Wealth Builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to another episode of Simon Dixon Live. Today we're going to be covering everything that I think you need to know about the World Economic Forum 2026. Now, I didn't watch the whole thing, but I managed to get out the things that I think everyone needs to know to prepare for what's coming next. And what are we going to be doing? Of course, we're going to be following the money, not the speeches. Now, I'll play a few clips from some of the speeches, but overarching, we're going to be retranslating because that is what the World Economic Forum is for. It is where the creme de la creme of the managers, not the shareholders, the managers of the shares share what they need the world to know so that everybody can adjust accordingly. And this is how they signal in these very large power circles of the proof of weapons network, whether it be the financial industrial complex, military industrial complex, or technical industrial complex. What you need to know is signaled at the World Economic Forum in Davos. So we're going to be breaking into three sections. Firstly, we're going to be covering an interview that Larry Fink, the CEO and the interim president or whatever he is of the World Economic Forum, Larry Fink said in an interview with Elon Musk. And we're going to be focusing on AI, China, and space, and who really controls the future. And there were some interesting insights there that match up exactly with our follow the money analysis and our movement towards a multipolar world order. And what all of this death, destruction, and violence around the world is, it's about getting the resources needed for this AI and robotics future, a long-term thesis we've been covering. In the second section, we're going to be covering Mark Carney's speech, the president or whatever they call it in Canada. And we're going to be discussing the asset stripping of Europe and Canada and how to read between the lines between the good cop, bad cop, between various nodes of the financial industrial complex like Trump and Carney. Now, the third one that we're going to be discovering in part 3, we're going to be going through the big announcement. This is the thing that we've been predicting, that everyone said wouldn't happen, and that is the border peace. And this goes through exactly, step by step, the history that we've been covering in geopolitics and why they need regional stability in the Middle East in order to power all of this artificial intelligence and this changing world order, and the transnational capital relationship we've been talking about with China, the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, and the financial industrial complex. Well, anyway, we're going to be using that in order to explain America's retreat and the Middle Eastern reset, and we have been preparing for. So without further ado, let's get right into a few recap of previous episodes, just so we're on the same page before I play the first speech. Now, we got the Elon Musk interview was a bit long. It was like 40 minutes or so. So I asked AI to create a little bit of a recap. We'll be playing that one shortly. And then with the other videos like Mark Carney and Jared Kushner on the border peace, I've pulled out some clips. So we'll be playing those ones as well. So let's just recap some of the previous things that we've been talking about. So we were waiting for this big event in order to make a transition to Israel being strategically vassalized into the GCC, Palestine being recognized with a rebuild plan where the entire Levant and the entire Middle Eastern region will be vassalized into the Gulf Cooperation Council. And then we will have some theatrical war like the 12-day war with Iran in order to manage that transition. And the only logical solution at the end of that will be some kind of announcement towards normalization based upon the reality that all the world powers, from my perspective, have already negotiated what the world order looks like. And we are splitting up the world into territories. And now we're getting the theatrical implementation where you're meant to believe we're going into World War III, but then we end in a crescendo. And I think this is why we have had this border peace that's set up. This essentially marks the end of the Greater Israel Project, which was always the military-industrial complex that was funding all sorts of militias across the region in order to destabilize the Middle East, to ensure that they could never compete with the dollar by unifying around their resources. And that created 100 years of death and destruction, from pre-World War I to World War II and everything that happened after Sykes-Picot when everything was split up. And in that, I've stated that US will be retreating to a regional power, and the dollar will be slowly weakened by breaking the Japan carry trade, the petrodollar, the euro dollar, and everyone will flee towards commodities. So where are we at right now? We have had a flee towards gold because everyone is selling their US treasuries in the foreign countries. And then internally, we're having a reform of the Federal Reserve so that you can push interest rates down and refinance those treasuries in the short-term duration. And we had almost $250 billion of treasuries refinance this week, and they were all short-term duration, whether it be a week, 3 weeks, 2 weeks. And so those have to continually be rolled over, but you get a lower interest rate because the lower the time you lend to the US government, the less interest they have to pay. If you're lending to them for 10, 20, 30 years, then you have to pay a higher interest rate. But the problem is that when you have any event that leads to the selling of those bonds, if they don't go through to maturity, then you end up with a higher yield. So when people refinance, you end up with the price that the US government has to pay going up. So we're now getting this reform of the Federal Reserve in order to push down the short-term interest rates, but that's pushing up the longer-term interest rates higher. And eventually you're steepening the curve, as it's called, where you have to roll over on the short term and you have to keep rolling over. And so that's creating a lot of stress in the market. They're performing abnormally. And so you need someone like BlackRock or Rick Ryder in the Federal Reserve, as we covered last week, so that you can continually roll over, pump up the stock market, and then you get what we called fiscal dominance, is the monetary policy of the moment that we've been discussing a lot. Now, when America is retreating into a regional power, they need to look strong. And so we have military operations that make them look strong as they are essentially contracting. And then the border peace is the mechanism for doing it. We're going to go through all of the details to make sure you understand this and the implications. Now, in the meantime, while America is being vassalized into the stock market, the debt is being pumped and bag held onto the American people. This is being utilized in order to vassalize Europe deeper and deeper into the proof of weapons network. And so financial weapons of mass destruction are used in order to vassalize, securitize, privatize, acquire in distress. And the more and more unstable Europe becomes by both energy and civil unrest, the more they can acquire those assets. And so they're doing a destabilization campaign in America by this extreme populist movements on the left and the right, religious tensions, racial tensions, and then deploying in the name of border security from the open border, closed border policy, which is essentially moving closer and closer and closer to martial law. And through fear, you can remove much of the constitutional protections, try and get a resistance with freedom of speech and then the Second Amendment, have a revolution, but you can use that in order to usher in the technocratic state, digital ID, stablecoin programmable money, artificial intelligence, and social credit scores. And so you've got the Trump administration with David Sachs, Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and the other people that were involved in currency wars like Scott Bessent and other Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, all actors that are deeply connected to the Jeffrey Epstein blackmail operations and those types of control grids that we've talked about. They're all ushering in this surveillance state for this technical industrial complex. Now, we had a little bit of beef between Greenland and North America with Canada in the middle. And so we're going to be covering the Canada side. But Canada is becoming a way of unifying American interests in the Western Hemisphere which are represented, which is essentially a proxy for the financial industrial complex, all the private equity, the fund managers, the banks, the institutions, the investment banks, and that complex and derivatives complex and market manipulators, and China Sovereign Wealth Fund and the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds that we've been covering. This is essentially is the new transnational capital that is able to use capital flows in order to get all the nodes in the World Economic Forum and the Proof of Weapons Network to push in the direction of moving towards multipolarity. And if anyone goes off track, you have the blackmail rings like Jeffrey Epstein and various other things where you can leak some emails and remind people that they need to be going on track. You can also knock people's share price off of the derivatives complex, making them get less access to index ETF funds, your pension, your insurance. You can use the media in order to, weaponize capital raising events. For example, the massive AI bubble with the Magnificent Seven stocks that then needed a correction because it was covering too much of the S&P. And so you had a narrative and the stress with the Federal Reserve that kind of reset and moved more of the S&P towards the energy stocks and the infrastructure stocks. But of course, the whole thing needs to be funded by money printing. And so we transition from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. You had the first signs of that. But the problem is in fiscal dominance is that you have high growth because you're essentially printing money like crazy, pumping up the stock market, and you're trying to offset some of that inflation. Artificial intelligence is going to move into an unemployment cycle. You need to get the price of oil down to offset some of that inflation, or you need to tax more through tariffs to take money out of the supply. And because America is an importing country, it means that those tariffs suck money out because it's a tax on small American businesses. They get merged and acquired up to the top of the multinational corporate structure. And then the financial industrial complex is able to vassalize through the K-shaped economy. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. Everything goes into pumping up those stocks. Eventually, you have to offset some of this inflation by getting the price of oil down. And so you have these big geopolitical events in terms of managing these portfolio. Now, one of the side effects of this is that the financial industrial complex, the FIC, has negotiated co-investment deals in everything with the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds. And so right now, the sovereign wealth funds, which are kind of part of the FIC, have become a part of the infrastructure. So therefore, you create a global nature, which is no UK first, no America first, no European first. And essentially, it's just about rolling over the debt on the people so that they can pay the credit card bill so that their savings go down and they get stripped out of assets as the stock markets go up. Now, because the sovereign wealth funds are now influential, for example, Saudi Aramco CEO is on the board of BlackRock as a seat position. They're able to influence US policy. America has sold $65 trillion of its assets to foreign control. Now, remember the structure. Those that control the shares influence the board. The board has the executives that work for them, like Larry Fink and Elon Musk. And then underneath that, you have management and structure. Now, the finance makes sure that you can subordinate the executives, whereby you can manipulate their share price, incentivize them where the share price goes up, then you get more value. And you can laden them up with debt by making them borrow against their debt. For example, Elon would borrow against his Tesla stock to acquire X. And now you can use X to make sure that NSA, the deep state, has access to all the data. And you combine it with all the Doge data. And then you build out this social credit score in this vast artificial intelligence empire, integrate it with the crypto stable coins. And combine it with Grok and all the AI. Now, that requires a lot of energy, a lot of data centers, and that's what we're witnessing right now. So in order to partner with the Middle East and move the environment to regional stability, the Gulf sovereign wealth funds are buying up all the American assets. That's giving them more influence, and they're partnering with the financial industrial complex, the FIC, and that's leading to the ability to persuade the military to stop bombing the Middle East and stop the forever war. And that resets the world order, because America is now that net energy exporter. So the military industrial complex, the MIC, is exiting. The FIC, the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds, the China Belt and Road Initiative, has created this multipolar world order based upon transnational capital. Basically, the military industrial complex has become a rental militia army where you can rent the American MIC. That's what we saw in Venezuela, where China ends up with a bunch of infrastructure, still able to buy the oil at a discount. The Gulf countries are able to service that at a loss to provide the capital. And then Chevron and Exxon, that need oil prices to be higher, they can partner with Gulf capital in order to acquire, and you get all this foreign direct investment. Now, while Trump is bragging about this $18 trillion of foreign direct investment and some internal stuff, foreign direct investment means you suck out the returns and you become influenced by foreign capital. And that's what's created this environment. So this is what I call the asset stripping phase, is asset stripping America, asset stripping the West, and vassalizing countries under the proof of weapons network, which is all the trends that we've been seeing. Now, we've been preparing across all of these different episodes over the years to get you ready for a world of AI, Bitcoin, central bank digital currencies, and how to protect yourself and to remain sovereign. We'll do some recaps at the end, as we always do. But the entire world is reconfiguring all of their assets, all of their resources, all of their supply chains in order to handle this artificial intelligence and robotic world that can eventually lead to mass unemployment, and how the world is going to handle that. And the World Economic Forum is kind of how you tease out that world. And we'll start going into some of the things as well. But that requires alternative forms of energy, because it's not just, is this going to drive the demand for oil and liquefied natural gas for electricity, and of course the rare earth minerals and the commodities that are all needed, and then the capex or funding that's needed in order to invest in all these data centers, as well as all the water and cooling technology, and obviously silver and all the commodities and copper and everything that's flying through the roof as we make this transition. They're saying, well, we're going to use all of that. In fact, America's going to go from 2% of all energy being for AI to 10 to 12%. And where is that going to happen? How is this energy going to come? Well, we need renewable energy. We need wind energy. We need hydro energy. We need solar energy. We even need space energy. We need every form of energy. It's not a substitute. We are literally taking all the energy of the world, pumping it into these artificial intelligence data centers, and going out and getting all the commodities, all the oil, all of the energy, all of the liquefied natural gas. And it is this transnational capital structure is essentially needing more and more debt, more and more fiat currency printing. So you're ending up in this world that we're seeing right now, all to do what? Replace humans with AI and robotics. And that's what we need to be prepared for. So it's every single form of energy. Because the technical industrial complex wants to expand globally. And that is this AI arms race that we're currently in right now. You've got America that has, its side of the sphere, and it has lots of energy. And so it is using its military to go find additional energy sources. But also because the Gulf countries and China providing the capital is acquiring much of the stock market, much of the assets. They're selling US debt, buying the stocks, and that's making them where they can influence NVIDIA and say, you go build your data centers here. And so we're seeing them being built around based upon where the capital is. Whoever has the sovereign wealth or the ability to roll over the debt-based Ponzi scheme, i.e. America, or the genuine manufacturing base and the genuine trade surplus is dictating the flow, and everyone else will get vassalized and asset stripped with the network. So in order to manage this transition, you keep printing money and you weaken the dollar, and you keep weakening the dollar further and further and further. And so even the worst of currencies and the worst of stock markets like UK and Europe are outperforming the dollar at the moment as well. So this is simply because the stock market is where all the financial industrial complex managed to asset strip, make the rich richer, the poor poorer. And so in this transition, all the foreign governments, as we said, are selling their US treasuries for gold. And China is building out ginormous solar energy because it's got the commodities. And then we had a squeeze on silver because silver is getting more and more industrial. I think about 60% of silver is just on electronics, data centers, military industrial complex technology, batteries, electric car vehicles, various other things. And so China's building all of that out, but they need to buy a lot of energy while they're, building out their renewable energy sources. And that's making the Gulf sovereign wealth funds richer and also creating dependencies upon Russia selling to China, Iran selling to China, and the Gulf countries selling to China. And previously, Venezuela was selling to China. And now Venezuela is still selling to China because Chevron wants the revenue. And it's not about, jurisdictional protections. This is about transnational capital. So they're working in partnership here as well, while engineering what looks like a trade war just to reset the order. And Trump and the administration need to give a MAGA narrative pretending this is going to be make America great again. Because you can't exactly tell people, by the way, we're removing world reserve currency because we're no longer as strong and we're controlled by a financial structure that means we're no longer a sovereign country. So you need someone like Trump to be able to rally the narrative continually. And that's exactly what he did at the World Economic Forum to make America look like it's strength while it is contracting. And so, as we said, the Gulf sovereign wealth funds are buying more and more of the assets. You got the SpaceX IPO, you got XAI, you got all the companies that were funded by the military industrial complex, and they privatized the technology, manufactured entrepreneurs to give them, this DARPA funding. And now transnational capital is acquiring and co-investing in every single deal. That's creating diversification in their country so that they can influence getting the AI data centers over, which is the future commodity of essentially being able to be influential in this world we're going to right now. But who's building all the infrastructure? It's China. Of course, China's going to be able to build, the only one that can build that infrastructure. And it will probably be the one building the infrastructure in Venezuela. And it will be done via shell companies. And we discuss more of that anyway. Now, what is driving this essentially? You have Gulf that's being backed by this BRICS corridor led by China, Gulf being led by Saudi Arabia, which has both relationships with US and China. And then China is taking that money and investing it in the global south. So now Africa is not being subordinated. And so Europe has to leave as they get weakened. America has to leave as they get weakened. And you're seeing China and Russia investing in building up the global south. And so now you're getting the highest growth in Africa as a result. And the US is essentially reconfiguring around how do we use our military industrial complex to get the energy so we can continue to be useful as we go into a regional power. And therefore, we need rare earth minerals and all the supply chain. And so you have Venezuela operations, you have the Greenland operations and the Greenland rhetoric. And the US is basically using its military via covert operations. Remember, I always said Ukraine was a war between the financial industrial complex, the military industrial complex, the technical industrial complex on one side, and Europe on the other side. And so they took out energy, they they took out the infrastructure and manufacturing base. They agitated Russia through covert operations. And then they'll be negotiating via this border peace eventually, once they've rinsed all the assets, all the money, stripped everything they can, that America will have part of that corridor that they'll take from Ukraine, and the rest of it will belong to Russia. And then they'll divvy up the rare earth minerals and make a load of money out of selling the weapons and get Europe to pay for them. And so UK is paying for them, Europe's paying for them, NATO comes along, increases the budget, and now you have this money printing that's causing inflation, and then Europe is being vassalized into the proof of weapons network, and all the debt is being ladened on the people, and so less and less money is being spent on servicing, roads, bins, just basic healthcare, social, welfare. All of that is being austeritied in order to send it to Ukraine and pump up the US stock market. And that's happening across the entire West. And you're being fed a narrative that this has got something to do with defending democracy. But obviously our listeners, they know the lies. Okay, right. So that's the background. That's really, if you want to not watch over 100 episodes of Simon Dixon Hard Talk, then I get of the journey that we've been following over the years. Right. Now, so to reiterate that, let's look at some of what the speech is, and I'll summarize some of them, and then I'm going to do a little AI summary of what Larry Fink and Elon Musk said that kind of reiterate this direction and what the challenges are, and signaling to the world what they want the world to be working on if you want to get some of Larry Fink's capital. And so during these meetings at World Economic Forum, Elon Musk sat down and he was praising, Larry Fink was praising Elon Musk, saying, you gave me 41% CAGR, compounded annual growth rate, on your Tesla stock, and therefore you get to continue in the network. That's why we allowed you to borrow against your Tesla stock by X, and you can funnel over those algorithms into the technical industrial complex, and you can co-invest with these Gulf sovereign wealth funds. This is how power works. Now, of course, there was a load of thing around the Epstein list and Elon being photoed, because the higher you go up in power, the more compromised you must be. And the more compromised you are, it's a mutually destructive network that ensures that power can remain, because every person that's reached that level of power, they can't snitch on each other because they're all compromised. They all have access to capital. They're all vassalized into this financial industrial complex. And although Elon appears like he's wealthy and free, he's actually fully vassalized and subordinate to this network. And anytime he goes off track or off kilter, then you get a rude awakening and a reminder that finance rules. Okay, so to go out and get that Doge data, go out and get all the data that's needed in order to usher in this Palantir surveillance state as well. So anyway, the interview was really about AI, China, space. There was some really interesting thing, but we're going to be discussing some of the little clips. Now, before I go through that, I'm not going to play all the speeches because there's just 4 days. It's all like hours and hours and hours. But a few of them that are worth just pointing out some of the different points. Basically, Kristalina Georgieva from the International Monetary Fund, her speech was really focused on artificial intelligence and trade fragmentation risk. And so basically, she was talking about an AI-driven labor market and what type of shock that will have on the world. So they're warning people to be ready that there is going to be a shock, because every business, if they had the choice, they don't want to deal with all this human capital. And so, while Trump's putting out the message, we're rebuilding our manufacturing base, they're building AI and robotics that will create a burst of employment to build out the centers, but they're building out their unemployment effectively. And so this is eventually going to lead to a labor market shock, and everybody needs to be ready for that. And of course, they're talking to the businesses, not the people. The businesses need to be downsizing and they need to be investing in AI, and they're going to be providing the energy accordingly. And so it was urging basically an urgent adoption by governments and firms. Now, of course, what is governments and firms in the West? Well, they're all subordinate to lobbies. And so they just represent the piggy bank. Their job is to create the justification for the central bank to print the money. It comes into the government by selling those bonds. The private bank gets the profits from buying those bonds. If in case there's any distress, the central bank also buys them through quantitative easing. And those that are closer to the money printer get the money at 0%. The banks get to create the money, and then they can reallocate it. So they pay for the lobbies, and the governments are essentially now subordinate to the corporate lobbies. And so it's being used in order to prop up these stock markets to all-time highs. Now, that's creating a severe fragmentation from the reality of earnings per share in traditional matrix. But now the stock market is just a function of money printing. And then if you're good receiving some of the money printing capital, then Larry Fink, those that are managing your pension, they'll make sure that your share price goes up to be included in index funds. Then you get passive investments through index funds. And then they can manipulate the media in order to make sure that the narrative is needed to provide all the capital and asset strip all of the government so that they just don't spend any money on anything else other than propping up the stock market. And of course, the most compliant with that is Trump. He's your financial industrial complex. He's very compliant because he aligns his interests and he's there to make as much money as well. So anyway, the IMF was talking about macro uncertainty, trade tensions, talking about all the other things for the world leaders to get together. And this kind of, the whole growth assumptions and everything are being changing and everything's being rewritten. So it was all about really a change in world order as a result of this. So those are like a couple of the speeches. Now, what I want to do right now is I just want to reiterate and hone in this point, because Elon Musk and Larry Fink were talking about the bottlenecks in transitioning to this world of AI and robotics. So Azad, let's play the first AI summary for the Elon Musk and Larry Fink interview.
And it all starts with this one.
Okay, so everyone's buzzing about, the alien comments from that Musk and Fink chat at Davos. But I feel like they totally missed the real story, the actual warning siren.
Totally. I mean, if you strip away all the sci-fi stuff, Musk wasn't really talking about E.T. He was laying out a very specific roadmap for our immediate survival. And it all starts with this one massive bottleneck.
Energy.
The physical impossibility of powering this AI revolution on our current grid.
Right.
So Musk, he lays out this premise. And honestly, it's pretty alarming for the West. We're flooding the world with compute. AI chip production is growing exponentially.
But the power to run them isn't.
Not even close. Electricity supply is just crawling along. Maybe 4% growth a year.
So we're building these incredible brains, but we're basically starving them.
That's the perfect way to put it. Energy is the hard limit. And that's where he dropped this stat about China that it seemed to change the whole mood in the room.
Yeah, the China stat, I honestly had to double check that figure. He said, was it 1,000 gigawatts of solar per year?
1,000 gigawatts. It's staggering. And to put that in perspective, he said that deployment alone, paired with batteries, could match half of the entire U.S. electricity output.
Half, just from what they're building right now.
And that's where Larry Fink kind of pushed back, right? He's looking at it from an inventor's point of view.
Of course. He asks the obvious question, why aren't we doing this in Nevada? The land is there, the sun is there.
The physics works. 100 by 100 mile patch could power the whole country.
So what's the problem?
Well, it's not physics, it's policy. Musk pointed right at the tariff barriers. The U.S. is blocking cheap Chinese panels to protect its domestic industry.
But I mean, isn't that just standard trade protectionism? Why is this specific to AI?
Because of the speed. That's Musk's whole point. While the West debates tariffs for 2 years, China builds 1,000 gigawatts. The timeline of AI evolution.
Yeah.
It just doesn't wait for the WTO.
So we're essentially regulating ourselves into obsolescence.
That is the risk.
Yeah.
If you want to run massive AI models on Earth, the energy math right now heavily favors China.
Okay, so if the U.S. is kind of paralyzed by regulation and China has this manufacturing monopoly, where does that leave a company like, say, XAI?
Well, according to Musk, it leaves them with no real option on Earth, which is why he's not just looking for a new power plant, he's looking for a whole new jurisdiction.
He's going to orbit.
He's going to orbit.
Solar-powered data centers in space. I mean, it sounds a bit like he's just dodging the tariff issue.
Oh, he is. But he's also solving a huge thermodynamics problem at the same time.
Ah, the cooling. Right. People forget these data centers are basically giant heaters.
And they drink millions of gallons of water, which is a scarce resource. But
Yeah.
space is just, it's sitting there at 3 degrees Kelvin. It's a natural cryo cooler.
You just delete the entire water bill
Yeah.
and all the cooling infrastructure.
Exactly. Plus, solar is something like 5 times more efficient up there. No atmosphere, no night.
Okay, but usually space stuff means, 20 years away, right?
Not anymore, not with Starship. He thinks they can start deploying these things in 2 to 3 years. He wants to scale to hundreds of terawatts.
2 to 3 years, that feels incredibly aggressive.
Well, he argues it has to be. He dropped another prediction. He said AI will be smarter than any single human by late 2026.
Wait, late 2026? That's this year.
This year. And smarter than all of humanity combined by 2030.
Wow. So this isn't really a race for chips then. It's a race for joules, for
Yeah.
raw energy.
The race for AI is a race for energy. And while Earth-based politics are slowing down the West, the future of compute might just move off planet.
It's a lot to take in. I keep thinking about how Musk ended it with that line about the tiny candle of consciousness.
Yeah. He sees humanity as this small light in a vast, dark universe.
Yeah.
And his argument is we have to expand to space to solve these big problems, to make sure that light doesn't go out.
So optimism as a survival strategy.
You'd probably say it's the only logical choice.
Well, whether your next AI interaction is being processed in a server rack orbiting 300 miles up or in a field somewhere in China, it seems the game has definitely changed. Thanks for listening to this deep dive.
Okay, so there's your little summary. You're welcome to go watch the interview yourself, but it was like about 40 minutes, so I didn't want to go through it all because we've got a lot to cover today. But I hope you really understand that everything you're being told right now is a lie. Everything you're being, kind of all the different narratives of, oh, this is about religion, this is about racial, this is about drugs, this is all just narrative. When you follow the money, you can see the truth, and everything they say is a lie in the media because the media is fully captured and the politicians are fully captured. The Proof of Weapons Network, through their lobby, they're able to control the Congress, control the Senate, and control all the different nodes across Europe, Canada, Australia, and the collective West. Any country that got their central bank to be a member of the Bank for International Settlements and also privatized all of their resources so that they could be acquired and managed all those private pension schemes so that effectively the Proof of Weapons Network and the financial industrial complex could weaponize your pension and your insurance to make sure that you own nothing and you'll be happy. And they want to custody everything rather than you being able to self-custody. And that's what this is all about. Now, eventually, that leads to mass unemployment. And so therefore, they need all of this money to be invested. So pitch, what was essentially happening there is that Larry Fink was saying, well done, Elon. You gave me 41% return on investment. Keep being a good boy. If you do that, I'll allow you to borrow against your stock, and I'll call Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, and he'll issue you some credit to be able to buy more assets as long as you utilize them for us. And we want that to go deeply into the military, and then the military go back into the deep state, and then the deep state can create the narratives and the false flag operations that's needed in order to scare the hell out of everybody, manufacture more war so that the budget can go from what Trump was saying, hey, why do we need $1 trillion? Let's do $1.5 trillion. So then they can go and sell all those weapons, pump up the stock market, and try and keep the debt-based Ponzi scheme going a little bit longer. In the meantime, they're preparing their exit. They figured out where they're going to go. and they're going to be leaving all the debt and leaving all the civil unrest onto everybody else while they're preparing how to hedge and transition to a multipolar world order while they slowly correct, and break the dollar as world reserve currency because it's not producing the returns that they need right now. And so Elon was told that he's a good boy. Now he was given the next narrative. If you don't give me $1 trillion, then we're not going to have solar panels in space that are cooled, so that China will end up controlling all the energy and they'll win the AI race. And so therefore, figure out how to roll over more debt and make sure it comes up into my stock price. And if I can make that happen by giving the narrative in the World Economic Forum and Trump plays along, then everybody gets wealthy while the K-shaped economy goes into burning energy and making sure that we have what we need to launch. And of course, Elon Musk gets to say, I'm the biggest, baddest entrepreneur in the world, while he's using all of this, innovation that was created within the government structure, and the profits were privatized while the losses are socialized in the debt-based Ponzi scheme. Okay. All right. Well, and of course, China, which doesn't have, oil in the ground as much, is going to be investing in all this infrastructure. And they've got the manufacturing base. And they pretend they're in a trade war with China. And so what was the other thing? He said tariffs are the issue. And so basically he's saying the US won't be competitive if we have if you don't deregulate and take out some of these tariffs. And so what will happen? The large multinational corporation will offset some of its tariff through its large international structure. And only the small business in America will pay the tariff because they're a net importer. Now, if that sends their company bankrupt, the banks will then acquire through Blackstone and the private equity industry and roll them all up into the share price of the larger transnational corporation. And of course, Trump is doing everything to be that. And this isn't about Trump. I'll analyze whoever the president is. This is uniparty. You just get a different flavor of narrative if you still believe in this Republican and Democrat. Now, Trump is leading up to his next mission, which is internal election, which means he has to go out to all of his backers. He needs to go to everyone that funded him, like Elon Musk, and say, have I done enough for you? What do you need next? In order to get that funding, spend it into the economy, pump up the marketing budgets and all the different things that are needed in order to keep the Ponzi going. And of course, no president can change anything because now they're in the funding cycle and the lobbies will all be negotiating, saying, you didn't do this to me, you didn't do that to me. And they'll say, well, this person paid more, you paid more. And they just prostitute themselves off for this rolling over the proof of weapons network and the debt-based Ponzi scheme. Right. So I hope that that helps you kind of understand that nothing stops this train and you need to figure out where you fit in with that. What investments you're going to make, how you're going to protect yourself. And obviously we've covered this all the time as well. But in terms of that is the World Economic Forum, I think the important things that you need to know, not about the technical stuff and the Star Wars and the stuff that they want you to focus on, but the hidden messages that they'll be pushing out to the proof of weapons network and following the money so that you can get ahead of it. And nothing stops this train because all stocks that have geopolitical significance will receive the money printer until no one will buy those bonds anymore. So speaking about that, we're now going to move into part two. Now, that was all the technical side. And in part two, we focus a bit more on some of the macro stuff and some of the macro speeches. And so let's go straight into part two. So in part two, the speech I'm going to play is an actual speech rather than an AI summary because I found, a clip that was put together that covers just the key things you need to know and understand. But I'll go through a few of the speeches, but we'll play the Mark Carney one. And the theme here is I would like you to understand what this means for the future of Canada and Europe and how these asset stripping exercise actually works. So just before we play that and go through the things you need to know, let's start with some of the different speeches. So one of the speeches was from the German Chancellor, Merz. And Merz is a node on the Proof of Weapons Network installed in order to turn Germany into a vassalized asset strip state. Basically, he was talking about a warning of the great power politics. He wasn't talking about turning on nuclear energy. He wasn't talking about how to become more independent by partnering with Russia and getting access to their cheap natural gas again. He was simply talking about what he needs you to know, the narrative between European Union, Greenland, and America. And so it was really focused on how the world is entering into this great power politics, where essentially the forces are used for leverage, and the norm, the international order, is no longer there. So you'll get this constant theme around the rules-based order. And he's signaling to the world that we're now no longer needed to pretend that there was international law that the West followed or America followed. And that's a constant theme you'll see across these speeches. The reason for that is because weaken the dollar, deconstruct the deep state, and redeploy it for transnational capital. And so using it to prop up the dollar through covert wars, through USAID, through the National Endowment of Democracy, through genocide, death, destruction, violence, piracy, stealing of resources, destabilizing countries, preventing competition, financial weapons of mass destruction, weapons, bombs, IMF, debt, slavery, destroying people's savings through currency wars, crashing people's savings, creating bank runs, everything that was used in order to prop up the dollar globally, in order to extract the resources, regime change, installing dictators, pretending you're defending democracy, making sure that there's corrupt channels there, using the media, using United Nations, using the World Bank, all of the mechanisms that came out of the post-World War II Bretton Woods order. We're making them all fight so strategically you can deconstruct the fabric and move over to this financial industrial complex in its raw form and make people think that we're taking on the deep state. That requires the narrative that Europe rules the world, and that there's this shadow bank for international settlements, banksters type of thing, and the British Empire and the British monarchy, and the Fed and Trump is taking on the Fed, and he's taking on the deep state, and he's draining the swamp. So he's really pitching to the dumbest construct of his voter base, while anyone that can follow the money understands that the largest shareholder of the Bank for International Settlements is the Federal Reserve. And that changes based upon power dynamics. And who owns the Federal Reserve? The member banks. Who owns the member banks? The banks. Where are the banks? The banks are on the US stock market. Who owns the majority largest shareholder position in US stocks? BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard. And they get to manage their portfolio because they're controlling your pension. But they make you want to think that, while old legacy players like Rothschild family still have shareholdings via these trust structures, but now it's very much, as the rise of China, there was a new wealth dynamic, the rise of the Gulf being able to free itself from some of the bad deals. That's created the rise of India. This has created new wealth dynamics that are able to influence because America's selling all of its assets to foreign control. And so there's a real narrative around the European-American war. Now, remember, all European leaders are fully vassalized into the same proof of weapons network and FIC that controls the financial industrial complex, that also controls America as well. So they're controlled by the same sides. But what has always been the divide and conquer strategy? Well, it's strategic tension. So you manufacture narratives, push them out by algorithm, weaponize them in the media, and dumb down the people so that they think that they're distracted with a different type of war. They think it's the Democrats versus the Republicans. They think it's Jews rule the world or a Muslim invasion, depending on which side they sit. They think it's a white nationalist movement versus demographic changes. Now, all of these things may have elements of truth to them, but they're also used as divide and conquer strategy. And one of those is to make all the Europeans help the Americans and make all the Americans hate the Europeans as well, and pretend that the deep state is just like this European thing that Trump's about to take on. So you had lots of narrative around, whether you're on the European or the American. That was really prevalent in all the speeches, the Trump speech, the Merz speeches. But basically, Merz was calling for Europe to strengthen its unity, i.e., they would like the European Central Bank to print more money, and then they would like defense investment, i.e., prop up the US stock market with money printed by the European Central Bank, and have the narrative that the Europeans need to make themselves independent from the Americans by buying more weapons. And who does that benefit? Well, it drains those euro dollars that are created through the European banking system, repatriates those dollars home, and is used to prop up the US stock market and military industrial complex stocks. And so what Trump does is he comes out and says, I'm going to stop MIC companies and executives from share buybacks and paying bonuses. But at the same time, he announced, but your budget can go up from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion. What he's essentially signaling is go and get more innovation, integrate with the technical industrial complex, and I'll get you a bunch more money. I'll make it look like I'm going to take away your bonuses and share buybacks. But really, if you deliver this, this, and this, because I need to sell more weapons, I'm not defending America. I'm selling more weapons. I need to sell more to the Middle East. I need to sell more in Asia. I need to sell more in Europe. And they want to just keep selling. Nothing to do with national security. All about propping up the stock market to push the K-shaped economy, increase GDP, and make sure that stock market goes up. So what we're seeing here is the theme is, the deception is, that it looks like they're both on the wrong side, but they're saying the same thing. So Trump is saying, we're the strongest military in the world, we're going to spend more on military. Merz is saying, we need to be independent from America, we need to build our own military. But they're still buying from the same companies. And so you have these, if you're further on the left and you believe that America is the bully, then you gravitate towards that narrative. If you think that Trump is taking on the deep state, then you gravitate to that narrative, but you're serving the same agenda, which is leaving you with all the debt while the rich get richer and own all the stocks to roll over the debt-based Ponzi scheme, because nothing stops this train. And so, he was talking about competitiveness and strategic necessities and these types of things. He explicitly pushed back, or what else have we got on? Oh, yeah, that's of course. Yeah. He also pushed back on the Greenland side as well. So the Greenland side is getting ready for the next phase of how to pump the US stock market. So everybody buys more. Everybody then deploys. So you get a theater like something's about to happen. But in the end, everyone's vassalized into the same financial industrial complex. And the US military is just going to be used to make some more revenue. And then in this one, I'm predicting there'll be a financial transaction here done. I do believe that Greenland will have a deal. And of course, they use that to create more volatility in the stock market. So they crash the market by the EU-US trade war. The insiders in the hedge funds that are at the top of the FIC would know about that. So they were positioned for that volatility. And then they start saying, the reversals of deals, and then it de-escalates and you start moving towards the framework of what a deal actually looks like. But anyway, you're going to get a lot of narrative that they would respond firmly, and that was kind of that justifying why NATO needs to spend more money, so that you can bring that back to the German people as your primary thing that they have to do as things get worse and worse in these civil unrest campaigns in Germany. We had a speech from, of course, the old favorite, Zelenskyy. Is getting a little bit tired right now. I'm not sure everyone's falling for the old sales pitch, but the Ukrainian president is, always giving the same narrative that we've been hearing for years and years after the CIA covert operations that regime changed in 2014 and then later installed Zelenskyy. And then the European leaders were using the media in order to pretend they're defending democracy, agitate Putin, and then in the end, Russia's just going to be split. Sorry, Ukraine's going to be split for all of its resources between the U.S. financial industrial complex, the MIC, and Russia in the end. So, of course, Zelenskyy needs to push out and make sure that we need a wake-up call because he needs the European money as well. That needs to be spent back into the U.S. stock market as well. So publicly, basically rebuked that Europe for being fragmented, saying we need to unify more. Maybe we need some fiscal union. Maybe we need a capital market union, centralized further and further, so that when they're ready for saying we weren't able to raise finance in time, and then you can vassalize everything into these European stock markets. And remember, all the stock markets, the European, the UK, the German, the French, they're all at all-time highs, and they're all doing incredibly well. So he was criticizing fragmentation, insufficient action, that basically what's happening is because people aren't giving him enough money. Repeated warnings that, of course, this is Groundhog Day, and we need to aggressively come against a force that he knows he can't win against, sacrifice more Ukrainians, and it's over, but he needs to keep going for as long as people will believe it as well. And basically just pushing that Europe needs to become a true security. It needs to use sanctions more. Remember what sanctions are. When the US sanctions Russia, it ends up basically being a sanction on Europe because Europe is still importing from Russia. And so it weakens Europe so that they get vassalized further. And China and Iran have already got their trade structure with Russia, so that the sanctions don't really do anything. And all the oil is still flowing because America is not controlling the ports that they used to control, because we've already in a multipolar world. This isn't, are we going multipolar? This is, we are multipolar. Remember, American GDP is only 25% of global GDP. The rest of the world has 75%. And the credit card bill means that only the wealthiest 10% are doing the consumption now. And those 90% can't roll over their debt anymore. So Trump comes out and says, let's reduce interest rates to 10%. Now, whether that can happen or not, I think it requires an act of Congress, but essentially it's roll over the Ponzi scheme. Whether that's just narrative because whether any credit would be issued at 10% because whether it can happen or not is another thing. But again, we don't need to analyze everything, because until this actually looks like it's happening, let's not spend all the time doing it as well. But anyway, Ukraine needs more defense capacity. They want to use those frozen assets. And interestingly, when Putin was invited to the border peace, which we'll be covering in part 3, he said, well, I'll join and I'll pay the $1 billion membership fee, and that can be used to rebuild parts of Ukraine, but it has to come from the sanction money in Europe. And so, American stock market wants that money, and it will end up back in the stock market, whatever this negotiation is anyway. So that's what Zelenskyy was doing anyway. He was really stressing that he needs credible security guarantees. He needs the US backstop. And he had a productive meeting with Trump in order to discuss what the next step is. He might as well have just had a meeting with Larry Fink and Lockheed Martin instead, but maybe it was done via Trump so that they're on the same page when they're giving their theater. We saw a speech from Ursula van der Leyen, the European Commissioner president, and it was really that similar rhetoric across Europe as well. So it was framed as there's going to be massive geopolitical shocks, the opportunity for Europe to basically rebuild security, buy more weapons. It needs an economic strategy based upon feeding the military-industrial complex. It needs more demographic resilience, whatever that means. This is prepping for the digital ID, because when you do the open borders, closed borders, and then you start enforcing some of the immigration policy, they've already beta tested the pre-crime Palantir technology, arresting people for social media posts in the UK. And then they want to do more and more of this digital ID rollout. They're going to be doing the digital euro. They've already getting ready for the next beta phase, so it can be integrated. So you can start to push the narrative around demographics. And obviously Elon will be pushing out. You can have this fight between Europe and Elon. Meanwhile, Europe is pushing the narrative that Europe's need to send the money back up. Elon's looking like and America's pushing that narrative. And then you're doing any of the power of the regime change and manufacturing the civil unrest. You can get nodes like Tommy Robinson, who, by the way, now suddenly is doing geopolitical analysis for the UAE after going to Dubai. So now he created a narrative that took all the millionaires and billionaires that are fleeing the UK because of the Muslim invasion. And now where are they all going? They're all going to Dubai. And so the UAE Sovereign Wealth Fund benefits from that. They get all of the millionaires and billionaires from the UK over to Dubai. That increases the productivity and the amount of, the strips out those that have the wealth in the UK while the asset stripping exercise is happening. And then they push out media saying Muslim Brotherhood is dangerous. And then US sanctions Muslim Brotherhood. And then you say anybody that is, you're a part of Muslim Brotherhood, which is a vague term. There's no, how do you know whether someone's a member of Muslim Brotherhood? But then you can do the arrests and everything you need. And what's happening every time someone gets arrested, they're having to hand over their phone. They're having to get their face scanned, and they're just feeding the algorithm. And now what does America say? America says, if you want to come into the US, you have to give us all your email data, all your metadata. You have to give us all your social media data. And they're building out the database, but it also strategically weakens the dollar because less people will travel. And so you push out these different things. So obviously Europe will start emphasizing, and these demographic issues will just be completely weaponized. And she was pitching Europe's case for investment. So that's trying to get some of this independent money as well that will be needed in this. Anyway, there's a whole narrative around EU being positioned for strategic competitiveness, building their autonomy. And really, those were the central themes of everyone that was talking about Europe. And of course, you need all the energy. So you still need a bit of the climate change narrative. Trump does the climate change hoax. Europe does the climate change. They get to buy from China all of those devices to get the renewable energy up as well. And basically Europe becomes a piggy bank for the AI renewable energy sources, while it's weakened because America has the energy that they got as well. There was also a speech from Christine Lagarde from the European Central Bank. It was inequality, cooperation, and AI constraints. So it was really pushing and emphasizing that there needs to be cooperation around artificial intelligence, whatever that means. But really, it's about energy and data centers. and the broader system pressures. What are they preparing people for? People are going to be competing with AI, which is going to lead to potentially higher gas bills. And we saw in America that American natural gas had a massive spike in its prices. And with the rhetoric around US moving some of its military ships over to Iran, we had an increase in the price of oil up to about $65 after it came down to under $60 during the Venezuela operation. And then when ExxonMobil said we can't do anything with it, and Chevron is kind of holding oil, waiting for higher prices, the price of oil started coming up a bit from that as well. It talked about preparing people for the K-shaped economy. So this is basically talking about inequality as a destabilization force, which it will be. But that destabilizing force is manufactured, and the European Central Bank is creating the wealth inequality through rolling over the euro debt-based Ponzi scheme. So while they get to pretend and say that that's going to cause inequality, they now have the perfect reason and excuse to say it's because these destabilizing forces. And so therefore, of course, if we're going to have this destabilizing forces, we need a digital euro, digital ID, Palantir technology, pre-crime, and everybody needs to prove that they're over 16 when accessing a website so that we can force people into the digital ID adoption. That will build your social credit scoring, and that will be integrated with the digital euro as we slowly roll this out. And then finally, it culminated. That was all the European leaders with their World Economic Forum, Bank for International Settlements, European Central Bank agenda. We also had this kind of rhetoric around the big bully America and Canada fighting back by aligning with China, which is part of the transnational capital that the financial industrial complex is aligning with, and Qatar, which is the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund. So you had this acceleration of partnership between Qatar and transnational capital in Canada, Qatar, and Canada as well. Also, reiterating partnership with Europe, which, come on, we'll go a little bit deeper into that. He knows exactly what he's doing. This is the ex-Bank of England governor. This is, he knows how these systems work and what he's doing. But we had the speech effectively from Mark Carney. Now, this is the one that I'm actually going to play, and then we can do a little bit of analysis of what it actually means. And then we'll go through the implications, wrap up the macro section on the European Canada side, and then we'll go into the geopolitical side and the big announcement, which is major, the border peace. So, Azad, could you play the Mark Carney clip?
Is fading. That the strong. It seems that every day we're reminded that we live in an era of great power rivalry, that the rules-based order is fading, that the strong can do what they can and the weak must suffer what they must. And this aphorism of Thucydides is presented as inevitable, as the natural logic of international relations reasserting itself. And faced with this logic, there is a strong tendency for countries to go along to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. Well, it won't. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Over the past 2 decades, a series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. But more recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. On Arctic sovereignty, we stand firmly with Greenland and Denmark and fully support their unique right to determine Greenland's future. Our commitment to NATO's Article 5 is unwavering. So we're working with our NATO allies, including the Nordic-Baltic Gate, to further secure the alliance's northern and western flanks, including through Canada's unprecedented investments in over-the-horizon radar, in submarines, in aircraft, and boots on the ground, boots on the ice. Canada strongly opposes tariffs over Greenland and calls for focused talks to achieve our shared objectives of security and prosperity in the Arctic. Argue the middle powers must act together because if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. But I'd also say that great powers can afford for now to go it alone. They have the market size, the military capacity, and the leverage to dictate terms. Middle powers do not. But when we only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, we negotiate from weakness. We accept what's offered. We compete with each other to be the most accommodating. This is not sovereignty. It's the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination.
Okay, so there's a couple of important points that I think people should be aware of in there. Firstly, is people took it as kind of Canada exposing what we all know, that America has never followed international law and that everybody engaged in lying in order to defend while there was genocides happening and, you know, selectively applying the law and using media and creating narrative. So basically, he just confirmed how the system worked. But people took that as, all right, you know, he's like, he's trying to put himself outside of the system. Like, again, he's doing a bit of taking on the deep state, revealing things as they are, because everyone's figuring out that everything's a lie and there is no international law. But at the same time, achieving the same goal because they all work for the same financial industrial complex. So when Trump says we're powerful, we don't need international law, we're going to go get Greenland and Venezuela, we're taking out, you know, the deep state. It is projecting American strength, but when Carney is doing it from the opposite side, maybe more appealing to, you know, more orthodox leftist, I don't know what you want to say. He's saying it from the perspective of America's really strong. And so you'll notice everyone's trying to project American strength because the actual agenda here is that the West is being strategically weakened and asset stripped into the financial industrial complex that's partnering with transnational capitals. So when you listen to his message, it's the opposite of what he's doing. He was talking about aligning with Europe. Aligning with Europe is suicide at this stage. He was talking about exposing the system, that we're all lying. We're going to now, I think he gave reference to communist shop keepers that had to have signs that liked the Communist Party. And now the worst thing you could do, they would use violence to stop people taking the sign out of the window. And he was saying, we're now going to take the sign out of the window and expose America. So the end result is you expose America for what it is, but you also make it look like it's strong while it's downsizing because it's exiting the world as global hegemon. So these are the messages that I take away from it as well. Partnering with the EU is a suicide mission, so maybe there'll be something there, but Europe is the sacrifice. They're not sat around the table in transnational capital because it is a debt-based Ponzi scheme, but it's not world reserve currency, even though the euro is strengthening in this dollar weakening exercise at the moment. But there is no coming back for Europe. Like, just don't get your hopes up that this new alliance is going to save Europe. That's not happening. And Carney is on the mission just as much as everyone else is on the mission, just as much as Merz is, just as much as Keir Starmer is, just as much as Macron is. They are all there to create narrative, to asset strip the country and prop up the stock markets. Now, there are a couple of things. Now, the population across Europe is really drying up. You've got the demographic issues. You've got the fact that the wealthy are leaving, and you're having real birth rate issues because everyone's from this, these technical missions. No one's having children anymore. So you have a demographic crisis, and that's not going to change. And they've got to pay for all the boomers that are going to be retiring as a result, of this. So they're also got welfare states, which is a way of redistributing money to those managing the welfare states, which is the same financial industrial complex and insurers. And it's just theft from the government while framing it as being able to make the surveillance state changes you actually need. So because that is drying up, basically the FIC, the financial industrial complex, the MIC, the military industrial complex, and the TIC have big plans for Europe. And so they don't want to destroy the value of the stock markets, but they do want to implement the surveillance state, which requires the civil unrest they're manufacturing, but they don't want it to go out into all-out war. But because the military is exiting all of these regions, they now need to make up for lost profits, so they always need to agitate. And so Greenland is kind of the new corridor and the new shipping routes that are going to have between the trade. And this is going to be, between America and Asia routes. And so, this old route between Europe and Asia becomes really, really important. And so as part of the large negotiation that will be executed via this border peace during Trump's time, I don't think it's going to replace United Nations. This is just a special one-time operation, let's call it. But Green, and obviously there's going to be an old boys network of rich people that are going to be investing in all these war zones and trying to take the land and various other constructs as they scale out what they build in Gaza. We'll cover more about that in part 3. But Greenland has massive rare earth minerals. So this is what the technical industrial complex needs. They need it for their electronics. They need it for their laptops. They need it for their smartphones. They need it for the batteries. They need it for the electric vehicles. And China has a monopoly on it. So this will take like 10 years, 10 to 15 to 20 years. So this is not a short-term solution, but this is, a longer-term mechanism of renting the U.S. military-industrial complex while you strategically weaken the dollar so that in 10 to 15 years, you can access these supply chains while you can still use the US MIC by transnational capital. It will probably be China doing the infrastructure, and it will probably be the Gulf and the FIC that will put the capital up, as we saw in Venezuela. But this just basically is utilizing this American military to gain as much as of the resources that are needed. And at the same time, they'll do the same in Ukraine. And so when you have the North covered and you have Ukraine, the European routes and the Asian routes, then you have split the world up into the Western Hemisphere. And you can utilize money printing, leave all the debt with the people, and reallocate it to asset stripping, and then take that capital and profits and deploy it globally in order to reprice and have the capital outflows needed to move to the multipolar world that this global FIC is doing right now. And so Greenland, I think, and Venezuela and Ukraine are marking the divisions and the territories while soaking up all the resources and moving to this multipolar world order, looking strong while downsizing, because America was global hegemon. Now it's exiting as well. So this gives you anyway the security. You'll give the security narrative in order to justify that. You have the Ukraine pipelines via the Black Sea, and you get these different routes so that you can try and get some of these energy prices down to combat some of the inflation, while you pump all of this energy into AI and robotics that creates the unemployment. And then that unemployment creates the productivity. You bankrupt the small business through tariff, merge them all into the large multinational corporation, and then switch to this multipolar world of transnational capital that's being built. Europe's already facing the vulnerabilities. That was the purpose of the Ukraine war. Remember, the European Union was a pet project from the Bank for International Settlements. The Bank for International Settlements was originally created from Reichsbank during Nazi Germany. And it was the German bank and the Warburg family that was both on the Reichsbank and the Federal Reserve in its early days during that Great Depression period. That was the original vassalization operation to create the debt-based Ponzi scheme that the dollar is at the end of its debt cycle right now. And so the European Union that comes from that project, they created the demographic changes. And obviously US wars created all the refugee shifts. And the CIA was funding all of the CIA, MI6, and Mossad were funding all the human trafficking, sex trafficking, drug trafficking, weapons trafficking. Read books like Operation Gladio, and Covert Regime Change, Tower of Basel, and you can, go back into all of these histories. The Creature from Jekyll Island with the Federal Reserve. The IMF is the Confessions of an Economic Hitman, to understand some of the blackmail operations, One Nation Under Blackmail, like all these different books. Maybe tweet me and I can put a little bit of a list if anyone wants, or put in the comments below. But anyway, all of this has happened as a long-term multipolar operation. And if you want to be the leader of a country, you get blackmailed into the network. You have to be compromised. And so they started to have announcements. I'm not sure if you saw them, around house raids of rent boys from Keir Starmer. Like this was some news that was coming out. Remember, when they leak these news, is to make sure that the leader is on track with moving the world to the multipolar world order. And UK, the politicians are just a battering ram that need to create the narrative and take the blame for when things get worse and worse. But the future of Europe, UK, the collective West is nothing but vassalization. There is no stopping that train with Europe. There's no diversification that's happening. All of the routes to get out of that are gone. Right. I would say there is one way that they can get out of it, and here's the problem. They'd need to diversify. Remember what I said, Europe had the opportunity. If it didn't engage in the CIA's covert operation with Russia, it could have just got its energy back on track by diversifying with BRICS. Now, it did start to diversify with the GCC. And so if you remember, the GCC were buying and they're creating more of these demographic changes. So just like the operation to asset strip the UK of all of its millionaires and billionaires and send them over to Dubai, these different blocks with the GCC were creating more and more dependency. So Qatar was doing a lot more deals, buying up a lot of those assets. But now a lot of those Gulf sovereign wealth funds and BlackRock, they're selling their real estate into what looks like what might be a property market correction in the UK. I'm not sure for Europe. I was analyzing the UK, but a lot of the Gulf sovereign wealth funds and institutional investors are selling some of those real estate assets. Now, they'll obviously keep the ones backed by REITs, real estate investment trusts, or unit trusts, because that's just your pension money. But with their actively managed stuff, they seem to be exiting some of those positions, which is creating a property market correction in the case of the UK as well. I haven't done much research on some of the European countries. But anyway, they could have diversified. They tried to diversify with GCC. They could have diversified with BRICS by still working with Russia, but instead they were doing the covert operations because all the leaders were installed in order to make Putin look like he's Hitler, to drive the "we're saving democracy" narrative, while America's killing Ukrainians and Russia's killing Ukrainians as a result of that. But anyway, I think that opportunity is over because the BRICS and the GCC have already set their alliances. They're already aligned with, getting the MIC to come out of the Middle East, end the forever war, negotiate the financial transactions, which we started to see the first announcement, and acquire some of that technology for regional security and the surveillance states as well. And so they've already got their alliances. So for Europe to try and disrupt that, it's too late. They're not a seat at the table. Each bloc is basically already getting what they want. China's getting what they want. They're the next empire, and they get to continue the Belt and Road Initiative. America got their Venezuela, their Ukraine routes, and most likely Greenland and Europe. Russia gets its part of Ukraine. Iran gets its vassalization into working with China, and those routes continue to work as they de-dollarize, and the financial industrial complex continue to weaken the dollar. So everyone's got what they want, and this was by collective approval. And this is what the border peace is about, that we'll be covering in part 3. There is no enemy. Like, these world leaders are coordinating and giving us theater. And the theater is the execution of what they've already agreed. And that's why, whenever these escalations happen, I just follow the money. While everyone's saying we're going to World War III, I'm just saying this is the cash flows that we've been covering. And so highly unlikely that this is going to happen. That was evident when the US did the operation with Maduro. I covered all of the flows previously. The stock market went up. Maduro probably had loads of stocks. It was held by a few people. Maduro probably cooperated in that operation. He'll be fine, whatever he's negotiated. China got to still purchase the oil at discount. Chevron got to still be there. And some of the Texan Gulf-owned refiners may be the ones that end up with the contracts. And what happened? China didn't react. Russia didn't react. Venezuela didn't react. What does that tell you? Wars are manufactured. Like, they don't happen naturally. And that's the whole point of these covert operations. So when you don't want it to go to war, it doesn't have to go to war. And that just shows you that the war has always been manufactured. So anyway, Venezuela was no reaction to it. The Venezuelan people ain't going to get any of the value. It's still going to flow exactly as it did before. So all this indicates to me that the EU is no longer a player, and they weren't sat at the table, other than the leaders being out there as narrative people in order to... They're not working for their countries anyway. That's what I was saying. Now, China, as I said, leading up to this, not China, so Canada leading up to this, they're attempting these different trade routes with the EU and China, but they have a similar vassalization journey with that. Who's going to be in charge of Europe on this side? Well, it's going to be the only sovereign wealth fund that actually matters, which is Norway. And so Norway, sovereign wealth fund, BlackRock and the financial industrial complex, they're going to be managing Europe. And so they've got the energy flows where they're able to manage it. And the financial industrial complex will be partnering with the Norway sovereign wealth funds, and Norway will have the leverage as they've been co-opted into this financial industrial complex. So the closer you are to Norway probably the better off you'll be. I know they have high taxes and various other things, but also, of course, Switzerland, their Swiss franc is pumping. It's still a safe haven. The Bank for International Settlements is still located there. And so it will be Switzerland and Norway that are essentially the most important nodes in the proof of weapons network for managing the asset stripping exercise alongside the US stock market hosted financial industrial complex, and also some of those European banks that are hosted on their local stock markets like the London Stock Exchange and various others as well. Now, of course, the money will still flow because even though the country's in disaster, the stock market still goes. The debt goes up, the stock market goes up, and the currency versus the dollar is managed so that it weakens the dollar, but doesn't create a breakout capital flow. And if the breakout capital flow does, it goes into real estate, it goes into stocks, and it goes into any type of infrastructure that supports any type of these AI data centers or acquisition of water resources or anything that's needed. And you can have a play on the renewable energy because the renewable energy will be, basically be used for some of this artificial intelligence as a more speculative side. But you can have a two-way bet. Either the energy works out, the capital flows, which increases the share price. And if it doesn't work out, then the vulture capitalists and the private equity and Blackstone come in and acquire. So BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and all the other managers, they don't want to crash the European stock markets. And while they're managing this transition to multipolarity, they want also the American stock market to continue to do well. Remember, the American stock market did well in 2025, but almost all of the other major stock markets did a lot better. The highest performing stock market this year is a bit of a farce, is Venezuela. But last year, you had the Spanish Stock Exchange, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, the Japan Stock Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, the German Stock Exchange, the Singapore, like they all did better than the S&P, which implies this capital outflow is happening, selling bonds, buying influence over the American stock market as well. So look, they don't want Europe to fall. They just want it to be a slow asset stripping operation. And any war they escalate because military needs to make up for lost profits, it can't be anything that creates an economic breakdown. It can't destroy the whole thing. But they don't mind some civil unrest because they want to usher in the surveillance state, the digital ID, the central bank digital currencies, and the pre-crime technology that they've been testing across Europe and across the UK. They definitely don't want to destroy the value of their investments. They want, BlackRock's $12 trillion of assets under administration. They want that to go up. And eventually they'll be hedging with these alternative products denominated in foreign currencies, as they have been. But they're more than happy with, a certain amount of complete, tension, civil unrest. They want to always have the defense spending. That needs to always go up. They don't mind friction, demographic issues, religious tensions. They don't mind censorship tensions. They don't mind anything that kind of creates regional instability, conflicts that are managed, but they want everything to be managed within the bound of what they want to happen there. They don't want any systemic collapse, World War III, European ginormous war. So more of what we've witnessed and escalation as well. It's just basically the gradual erosion of the European Union into these sovereign wealth funds and the financial FIC ownership, control, and structure so that you can subordinate more, vassalize more. And that will obviously tie into the transnational capitals, Singaporean sovereign wealth, Gulf sovereign wealth, China sovereign wealth, and Norwegian sovereign wealth as well. All this to say, they'll probably reallocate all of the money. If you look at all the narratives that were happening during the World Economic Forum speeches, it was all about defense stocks. So everything was about pumping those defense stocks. and making sure they got the instability that's needed in order to have that. Okay. What is the end net of this? You'd expect more money printing. You'd expect currencies to go up relative to the dollar. You'd expect stock markets to continue to go up. You'd expect more and more money moving to national security, and you'd expect less on expensive social security programs. Any type of social service will get sacrificed by pushing up the narrative. And so you could expect some kind of IMF bailout of somewhere like the UK or France that leads to mass austerity so that you can ratchet up the civil unrest, crash the real estate market, the property market temporarily, make sure the money all goes back into stocks, and then utilize the fact that the social services are getting worse and worse and worse to usher in the technology that is needed. And that's really what I think they were signaling in all of these different speeches at the World Economic Forum, and where you can go if you want to follow the money. So with that in mind, let's go into the final part, which was the most important part, the thing that has the most significant change and really confirms what we've been analyzing throughout our whole time in these Hard Talk Live episodes, that the Middle East is going to completely change, and that has knock-on effects. So I've told you about the downfall of the West, what it looks like. But remember, wealth doesn't get destroyed. It gets reallocated. So with the black pill of the West, there is a white pill of other regions. And you protect yourself. Obviously, I've always said Bitcoin and self-custody, hard commodities like gold, and then the manufacturing play with silver and various other things. You protect yourself with the orange pill, but it's not. People always say, this is doomerism. No, this is just following the money and reality of what's happening in the West. But remember, the West backed up the dollar by all of the death, destruction, rape, pillaging, genocides, ethnic cleansing, piracy, covert wars, dictator installments, all of that stuff. This is the best news in the world for others that have been on the wrong side of the bombs. Now, remember, some people in America and Europe, they're feeling very down right now. They're getting 1% of what the Western currencies did to other regions. And they're having mental breakdowns and stuff right now, go into degeneracy. This was just 1% of what the West of the world, people in Africa, people in Asia, people in the global South in general, in the Middle East, have had to suffer. So this will be the PG version of what the military industrial complex did around the world. And they'll just bring it home because they're not trying to, they've got a little bit less brutality than what they've done in the countries where they're not, where they just wanted the resources and that's it. So, just put that in perspective when you're thinking about these trends as well. Right, so that was the Mark Carney speech. Now, as I said, let's go into part 3. Part 3 is where we had a series of speeches, and this was major. This is what I've been looking for. It was, firstly, President Trump gave a speech. Then some of his team, like Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, who's not actually part of the government, but acts like he is. He's actually the fund manager for making sure that Trump profits from all the deals he's negotiating, funded by Gulf sovereign wealth money, and many of the world leaders, and some of them are very notable, that are going to make up part of the border peace, which is about the first project of how you transition Gaza into the execution of the 20-point plan. Now, we've covered this a lot, that it's going to be a technocratic nightmare, but it's also going to be significantly better. It's not going to be justice, but it's going to be significantly better than what they were getting under Israeli occupation. And so let's go through part 3, which is the Board of Police explained, how it integrates into America's retreat and how to expect that, and the Middle Eastern reset. And I'm going to go through a bunch of background. I really want you to understand this stuff, because when you understand all of the history that led to this, you won't be fooled for the covert operations and civil unrest campaigns that are going to be happening in the West, because you'll understand that this is manufactured. And that's been my goal, is to make you not be a useful idiot to power by buying into those narratives. Okay, so Donald Trump gave his normal speech as well. It was a Davos address, and it was kind of the thing you're used to, him getting ready for campaign financing, saying how everything is the best, making America look like it's the best of everything. Everything's great. Everything's happening. Everything's record. But the notable thing is that he did push the case for the US to acquire Greenland. And there was a bit of a pump and dump during that as well. So he was framing the different types of pressure tactics, including the threat of tariffs. And then that led to the removal of tariffs. And then that led to, the first version of a negotiation. I personally believe that this Greenland thing is going to be a negotiation, but it's also a good way of making some military, flexing some military muscle, which is essentially a brochure for all the weapons that the military is looking to sell to prop up the stock market. But it was really, floated out a framework around what a deal with Greenland would look like. The NATO secretary, kind of reiterated, the strengthening of sales. Remember, NATO is a sales strategy for the MIC, and what a deal could actually look like anyway, a cash settlement and various other things. By the way, if you're from Greenland, you probably don't have any say in this, but there's only 50,000 of you. If you've got any lobby power, I'd be pushing for a cash settlement, terms around what will happen to your real estate and your land and property, and also a percentage in a sovereign wealth fund, and a percentage of the cash flows that are negotiated. If you can get yourself any of that, then I'd be pushing and using any leverage you have of the population of Greenland to try and make something like that to happen. But the big initiative was launching the border peace. And it was signed off by a bunch of countries. Notable was that Israel wasn't there, even though there was announcements that Israel is joining. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but they weren't there. Netanyahu wasn't on the board, despite the fact that there was stories out there that Netanyahu's going to be on the board. But the countries that did sign up are significant in terms of reiterating that this is a change. This is a real change. This isn't the old tactics. Nothing stops this train from here. This was Trump and his team and BlackRock and all the regional players that all know already what is required in order to get investment in this rebuild project. And no investment's going to come in if they think Israel and Iran are about to go to a massive regional war. If they don't think they can demilitarize Hamas, who have agreed to it because they were funded by Qatar, and Qatar money was part of covert operations. We'll be going through a lot of that today. I really want you to understand this so that you don't fall for all the different narratives. If any of that was going to happen, if Hezbollah was about to uprise in Lebanon in reaction to the strikes that are happening right now, if the Houthis weren't going to reopen the Red Sea, now the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey have taken part of their strategic assets. If any of that weren't going to happen, and we were about to have Israel rules the world, and they're going to take over, like the debate that I did with Professor Zhang, and the Pax Judaica, and taking over Al-Aqsa Mosque, and creating a war that leads to Israel being the next center of the world, you know, the narrative that's going out there, they wouldn't be raising finance and they wouldn't be getting this deal. Now, okay, you could see it as a psyop, but I don't think so. The people that were in the room and that signed off on this agreement were Pakistan, that's aligned with China, historically aligned with America. You also had Qatar. You also had Saudi Arabia. You also had Indonesia, which has been, you know, very aggressive. And of course, Turkey. Now, Israel never, that was the big thing. They didn't want Turkey on there. But everyone that Israel didn't want to be there, as well as who they may have wanted there, was on there. And this is a signal of real power dynamics, that, you know, the transnational capital I've always been talked about. And so I actually take this seriously, not because I believe anything they're saying, but I'm following the monetary flows and everything's making sense based upon all the AI, everything that I've said in the tech section and the macro section. This changes the world forever. And once you get, as I've always said, when everyone said to me, this will never happen, once you get a security force that is not Israel in Gaza, the Greater Israel Project is effectively over. Now, what I'm going to play anyway is how this happened. Remember, Trump works with Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund and China. There's that transnational capital. He works for the financial industrial complex. He's been doing everything that they want in order to move to this multipolar world order through tariffs and various other policies. There were Jeffrey Epstein leaks, but nothing coming out that leads to a problem in order to make sure everything's on track. And the Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, set up in Trump 1 the fund that was going to profit, so that as all these illegal settlements are happening, you know, there's affinity partners investing so that the Gulf countries and the regional powers are going to end up in control of all of the land. And so while originally, and we'll go through this because I know people think that it's just Israel, and I think Israel's role has changed from what it is and how it's being framed right now. And it's evil, don't get me wrong. This is a division of the military industrial complex, and I'll be going through how this works. But we had a presentation from Jared Kushner raising finance. This is how they see it. This is just a transaction. If this doesn't tell you how all of these wars work, how the Build Back Better, you know, European World Economic Forum agenda works, that you destroy and make money from destroying, and then you build back and make money from building, and then you implement technology and make money from continual surveillance on a service, on a continual service model, and then it comes back to defense contracts. That's what propped up the dollar globally. And that's the message. That's how it's always been. Now, just because we saw in 4K, you know, real-time genocides but that's what everyone's been experiencing all along. And so you wonder why I'm happy that we're transitioning to this. And it doesn't matter what I think, because nothing I say makes any difference. I'm not advocating here. If I want to be the humanitarian, I'd want everything done differently. And I've been doing that all along. But I'm analyzing what I think is actually happening. And so with that in mind, Azad, let's go through the final video that we're going to play, which is Jared Kushner's presentation after Trump, after the signing of the board, the peace board, after all the different announcements. We got this ruthless, brutal sales pitch that highlights exactly what this was really about and how this really works. So Azad, let's play the final presentation.
Really, because of his heart, he wants to do this. So we did a master plan. We brought in, I thank Yakir Gabay, who's one of the most successful real estate developers and brilliant people I know. He's volunteered to do this, not for profit, really because of his heart. He wants to do this. And we've developed ways to redevelop Gaza. Gaza, as President Trump's been saying, has amazing potential. And this is for the people of Gaza. We've developed it into zones. In the beginning, we were toying with the idea of saying, let's build a free zone, and then we have a Hamas zone. And then we said, you know what, let's just plan for catastrophic success. Hamas signed a deal to demilitarize. That is what we are going to enforce. People ask us what our plan B is. We do not have a plan B. We have a plan. We signed an agreement. We are all committed to making that agreement work. There's a master plan. We'll be doing it in phasing. In the Middle East, they build cities like this in 2-3 million people. They build this in 3 years. And so stuff like this is very doable if we make it happen. Rafa will start with, this will show a lot of workforce housing. We think this could be done in 2-3 years. We've already started removing the rubble and doing some of the demolition. And then New Gaza. It could be a hope, it could be a destination, have a lot of industry, and really be a place that the people there can thrive, have great employment. Once this starts going, we think there should be 100% full employment and opportunity for everybody there. And we have a lot of data on what can be, but we think that this really gives the Gazan people an opportunity to live their aspirations. But it all starts with security, and it all starts with governance. Final note I'll just say on the Board of Peace, which is that all the lessons we're doing is we're basically studying the best practices from all over the world, and we're watching who does education the best, who does healthcare delivery the best. All of these things it's not secret IP. All this is IP that the Board of Peace is going to make public, and we want to encourage all the countries to be able to follow these best practices. A lot of the things that President Trump is doing in America, if they're working, we should all be copying them. If we find what's working in other countries, we should be copying them too. And so what the Board of Peace will have the ability to do if we're successful with Gaza is really show how do you do peace implementation, which is something that when we got this deal done, we didn't really find too much expertise or know-how on how to do it. So as we're creating this system, hopefully it's something that we can just document these learnings and make them available to all else who want to use them in the future.
Okay, so remember what I said. And I published blogs on this, and you can go to SimonDixon.com. You can go back in history and see everything. I said what happens in Gaza will mark the complete change into a multipolar world order. It will create peace in the Middle East and regional stability. But because China normalized between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and Trump would take credit for it, and then he'd later get the Nobel Peace Prize. So this is China and the Gulf's plan. But as America is the shrinking empire, they need to show strength and look like this is Trump doing it. But what is Trump representing? He is representing a model that will be rolled out around the world. And I said to you, whatever happens in Gaza is what they want to do to you. So when they do civil unrest in America and rebuild data centers, they're going to have a model for a full-blown, I think they call it freedom states or 15-minute cities and freedom cities. You can go out and look all these up. They will have, and we've already had announcements of Teslas that turn off if you're not, doing what they say, and houses that are going to be affordable for $7,000, and they can lock you in your house as a Tesla house if you don't comply with their social credit scores and digital IDs and stuff. Anyway, this is going to be rebuilt. This is why they can make housing unaffordable so that you can end up with whatever they end up building here. Now, who's going to be able to build this infrastructure? Look at everything that was built in the Middle East. It was built by Bengalis, by Indians, using Chinese infrastructure and Gulf sovereign wealth money. And then they purchase American technology and Chinese technology. But China has a bunch of technology. America's making enemies. China's making friends. China's rebuilding, and it's going to come with those contracts, which is why China's going to grow and grow and grow. And America's going to be asset stripped and asset stripped. And in order to manage that civil unrest, you need a police state and surveillance state. Well, they beta tested that in Europe, and they beta tested that, and they're going to be building it with this being the beta test. This is not conspiracy theories anymore. When you follow the money, this is happening. Like, this isn't just theoretical. And so what do you need to do in typical fake it till you make it, everything is a lie, pitch, PR, misleading? You need to call it the border peace. And if this doesn't tell you, if this doesn't make you want to boycott the system, Because who's going to benefit from all of this? It's going to be your S&P ETF. This is why I so appreciate being able to have an exit. This is why I like to boycott the Federal Reserve with Bitcoin in self-custody. This is why I hold it in self-custody rather than a BlackRock ETF. This is why I invest local wherever I can and spend local wherever I can. And this is why I don't invest in the funding of these evil operations. And so this is, I just hope people get to understand that the whole point of this was to obfuscate you from the human tragedy that is created to roll over this debt-based Ponzi scheme so that it can take all the assets from you, and the only people that make it are the ones that are compromised and engage in degeneracy and blackmail operations, while the rest just become a product with the debt. And this is how the system has always worked. You're just seeing it now because they're allowing you to see it now because they want you to be angry. That's the reality of it. Anyway, so what I want to do is I want to help you understand what this border peace is likely to achieve by following the money. This basically sets the new world order that I've been talking about. This is the transition to the multipolar world. Palestine ending the Greater Israel project is the linchpin for everything. So why is Gaza so important? Because the dollar is propped up by the petrodollar. America is energy independent and a net exporter. Everyone's selling their treasuries, and the financial industrial complex, or their bonds, and the financial industrial complex is strategically weakening the dollar. And so this creates that new transnational capital because the sovereign wealth funds are working with China. They have relationships. And that sets up what I've already been covering. And so the moment that Palestine is able to be, I doubt they'll get their land because they're selling it to investors. But the moment that they're able to be employed in the rebuild, and it makes me want to puke. As I said, this is not advocacy. Still better than what they had. The whole thing's disgusting. But when they are able to leave their country and they have self-determination and it's no longer an illegal Israeli occupation, the Greater Israel project is over, which means that the military-industrial complex has settled on terms to leave the Middle East, end the forever war once and for all. And they're asking, the mafia is asking the banks and financial institutions what they get in order to bless the region with not murdering their people and move into regional stability. So, as I've always said, what have I always said? If you're new to the show, I've got a lot of new people. A quick recap, and I want to make sure you got the history so you understand this, because when these operations are coming home, you need to recognize them. And that when you recognize them, you can empower yourself. In order to create peace in the Middle East, I have always said consistently, it requires three things. It requires normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That happened when China did it. It requires America military to stop using Turkey, Iran, Qatar, and Israel for funding their different proxies in order to destabilize the region. It requires that instead of the military sponsoring destabilization campaigns, the finance invests in regional stability and rebuild. And it requires a resolution to the Palestinian cause. Because without a Palestinian cause, Saudi Arabia would not normalize with Israel and join the Abraham Accords. And Iran resistance would continue, and all of that dynamics that was built out around this very clever divide and conquer strategy. If the military stops, the covert operation stops, and suddenly we'll recognize that war was always manufactured by radicalizing people and weaponizing religion in order to recruit armies and then destroying people, killing their families, killing their children, in order to get them to join these radical militia groups that worked for intelligence agencies in order to acquire land and acquire resources for Western interest. And the Islamist terrorist was manufactured in order to allow this. The radical Zionist was manufactured, and the radical Christian Zionist that would engage in covering up in this operation and taking funding to allow this to happen for the military-industrial complex in Senate and Congress was all manufactured to weaponize religion to create the useful idiots. Now, why are we finding out about this now? Why is the algorithm allowing this content to come out now? Because it's part of the weakening of the dollar campaign. It's part of the strategic divorce with Israel campaign. It's exposing it so that they have plausible deniability, so that all the American people think we're the ethical ones. Our dollar's not backed up by this. We just got blackmailed and Jeffrey Epsteined and AIPAC'd into this. And that's not alleviating the crimes against humanity that are happening by the Zionists and Israelis. But we've got to look to the top and follow the money. And the money's coming back to prop up the dollar in the US stock market. It's being revealed right now because there's an operation to reveal that, because the FIC wants to partner with the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds. And they couldn't beat America in its destabilization, so it had to buy it. And that's essentially what happened. So what they always used Israel for was to integrate into the region, dominate, have a greater Israel project, which was always the greater military industrial complex project to destabilize the region. Now, remember how the military works. And if you don't know how this works, let me tell you. Speak to other people on the wrong side of these bombs. And I used to work in investment banking, and I know how such deals are constructed. The first thing, the bent slide understanding, is that the military industrial complex, the MIC, they don't want peace. They definitely don't want peace. They are not defending anyone. They want bombs to continually be flying. They want proxies like Israel to continually buying and purchasing the money that was stolen by the money printer from the average American person. They want a continual supply of new innovation and new toys so that they can use it in laboratories. And Palestine was a laboratory for testing genocide as a service, occupation as a service, manufacturing covert operations to have extreme governments that are allowed to be funded. Are you telling me that Mossad, the most sophisticated tunnel, intelligence agency in the world, deeply integrated with the CIA and MI6, didn't know that Hamas were building a tunnel network? And they didn't know that October the 7th was going to happen? And they just accidentally allowed the money to get through via Qatar and via Iran? And they just happened to create the competing factions or proxies? No, that's exactly how these operations work. And we know that from many of the declassified documents I've gone through in the past, whether it's Iran-Contra, whether it's Operation Ajax, whether it's Operation Gladio, whether it's any of these operations that you can go through and read the book Covert Regime Change if you want to understand how these things work. But anyway, these are laboratories. These are brochures. And Israel is a laboratory for all the illegal stuff that the MIC can't do within America because they want to distance themselves from the genocide and just hire a militia to do it. That's what Israel's always been. So every single explosion is essentially a sales pitch for the MIC, for the Proof of Weapons Network. They like to showcase them. They want them to be filmed. They put them in a pitch deck. They explain the operations. Palantir very proudly shares what they've done in Israel, what they've done in Gaza. Every single casualty is really just a proof of concept for something that's going to lead to something they can pitch to the board of directors. That's how it works. I mean, this is the real world of how this mafia network works. And they're using your pension in order to invest in it. They create laboratories everywhere. They created a ginormous laboratory in Syria. They created a currency war and destroyed everyone's savings and laden Lebanon with IMF debt. They created, killed 1 million in Iraq, civilians, destroyed the country, left it for ruins. Used Halliburton in order to get all those contracts. And then they'll tell you that this was a mistake. No, the goal is not to win the war. The goal is to sell the weapons and rebuild and get the service contracts to prop up the market, to create demand for the dollar. So when an ally like Saddam Hussein wants to price their oil in euros, he's no longer an ally and he's no longer complying. So you kill people. And then you fund both sides of Iraq-Iran war. You give Iraq chemical weapons. And then on the Iran side, you have a weapons trafficking network in order to do covert operations and drug trafficking operations in Latin America. Iran-Contra affair. I've covered these. I don't want to cover them again. Anyway. All of these different operations are just basically testing grounds for their different types of gadgets that they want to sell. And Palantir was built, all the surveillance technology that was utilized in Gaza. Of course they knew October the 7th was going to happen. Or across Israel right now, you've got people asking that question. And when the war comes to an end, that question needs to be answered. When it's answered, that may be the civil unrest campaign to change the leadership with the GCC puppet and the Turkey puppet, or the regional model that will eventually asset strip the hell out of Israel and rebuild Gaza. And it will be controlled by, regional players that don't want violence in the region. This is the cost to get the American empire out of your region and allow you to live in peace. A ceasefire is not good. It means that you've got idle factories, you've got idle weapons, you've got, diminishing revenue, diminishing lines. They need to be sold somewhere else. Like the stock price needs to continue going up. If the stock price doesn't go up, then investors stop investing. You've got your 3-month cycle. It means that if prices drop, then the executives' share options don't get exercised. They get to borrow less against their stock, and they get to be subordinated late into the network. So they've got the model worked either way. They hedge it through derivatives contracts. So they just go push operations. When they don't work, they make money in the failure of the operation. When it does work, they make money in the success of the operation. So every single city, every single area is just for them. Like, so these are the same operations that are going to be done within the West. They've got weapons that they built that can be used and manufactured specifically for going in children's hands. They'd love a weapon in every single hand, just like a business would want to not employ anyone if they could and just have full AI. They want every single country to go to war if they could, and every single country can become a customer. That's how these companies work. And it's all paid for in the name of national security. They manufacture all the wars. They manufacture civil unrest to justify the wars. And if you go through my blog, I go through operation after operation, just actually going through the FBI documents and the cover-up operations. Now, just selling and stockpiling is not enough revenue, so you have to manufacture more. When you're stockpiling, you need to always create an arms race. And an arms race is what is being created in the artificial intelligence side right now. They need inventory to move. They need it to continually move. They want purchases, and orders. They don't mind if America has no national security left. That's the problem of America. They want to keep selling. And if they can't sell, then they'll do something at home to make sure they can sell. BlackRock, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, do you think these people care? Do you think they count the bodies? They've been doing this for decades and decades. That's why these blackmail operations exist. They just see the quarterly report that they need to meet every quarter in order to increase the revenue in their game. And the politicians just see the 4-month cycle and the 4-year cycle and the 2-year cycle, and the fact that they have to meet their goals of their lobbies. And we're calling this democracy, where the people actually matter. This is how the empire works. And the history that was always hidden is going to be rewritten from the rising empires. They're going to be sharing their stories that were always oppressed. So the way that the military-industrial complex works in this proof of weapons network that backs up the dollar, when the shooting stops, they have to negotiate with the rebuild contracts. And so the financial-industrial complex, they swoop in and they look at what deals they can do in order to rebuild. What are the rebuild contracts? What are the software as a services for the technology side? This just becomes the military profits were just a setup for the FIC. And then it's reconstruction, and that's where it moves over to next. The only way that you can actually stop the mix is to satisfy them that you can actually put together a better deal, because Mick actually owns FIC shares as well. And so they had to hedge so that when they go through this, at least they benefit. And you have to show in a presentation, how this will make more money by the rebuild and ending the war. You have to demonstrate it. You have to do a cost-benefit analysis. You have to do, what superior returns you can achieve, what dividends can be achieved, what share price can be achieved by allowing peace to be achieved. Right now, it is an absolute miracle that the Middle East has actually found itself in this position where, after a century of destabilization, it has actually found a set of circumstances where it's able to negotiate a military-industrial complex exit. That's a miracle. And so when something like this happens, yes, it makes me want to puke. But it also means that the old operations come into an end. And the old operation only comes to an end when a new operation starts. And the new operation starts is what they're pitching for investment. And when they're pitching as investment, as grotesque as it is, it means that the investors will want the set of circumstances that mean that their investment is okay. So what was October the 7th all along? Well, the way this actually works is the way that leadership works. You think you've got democracies, right? Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Well, democracy, as we know, is code word for corporate capture, because it's only the money that determines who the leaders are. And so what you would do typically is you would put a job description out there. Like Netanyahu would have received and picked up a job description through these covert mechanisms and compromised power network. And the job description, I'm being a bit facetious, but it will say something along the lines of kill as many Palestinians as possible and transform this American colony, because now we want to do business with the Middle East and Gulf states, into a legitimate state. And in order to make it a legitimate state, we can't have it being an apartheid anymore. And so there's a couple of ways that you can do it. You can just get rid of all the Palestinians and chuck them into Egypt and in the Sinai Desert. And we'll make sure that we pay Egypt bribe money load them up with IMF debt, destroy their currency, regime change them, do an Arab Spring to change the leadership, destabilize so that they are forced into submission. And we'll do the same with Jordan, and we'll do the same with all of the neighbors as well, with Lebanon as well. And at the same time, we'll allow resistance and uprisings by alternative factions like Muslim Brotherhood to persist. And then when they persist, we'll also create our own proxies from all of the victims of the Iraqi war, and we'll put them in ISIS training camps, and we'll create a resistance so that all of those can fight against each other too. And we'll make it out like they're doing it for religious reasons, when they've been manufactured and radicalized on purpose to maintain the cash flows and continually destabilize. And our media can be weaponized in order to change the narrative of what's actually happening so that we can radicalize the Americans through operations like 9/11 into joining the army and engaging in the missions where they believe that they have justice in order to do it. And that's how this works. And this is the only reason that we're getting a change right now, is because the financial industrial complex has made that presentation and partnered with the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund and said, we need access to those funds. And so therefore, let's switch the model and let's change the model. And so what they do anyway, Netanyahu at some point would have taken that agenda on, and somebody would have taken that agenda on. You know, for example, when they're recruiting for destabilization campaigns, somebody that came from the Iraqi war would have taken on the mission, said, yeah, I'll recruit the army and I'll do that for you. And then the covert operation happens. And what they happen is they have a contract. And that contract is like a mafia. It's like a henchman. The manager will say, I'll take on that mission and I have to deliver. And if I don't deliver, I'm taken out of the network. Trump accepted a mission for the financial industrial complex. And in between his two elections, there were two warning messages that were sent at him. And I believe those warning messages in those assassination attempts were, make sure you switch to a multipolar world for the financial industrial complex. He's doing it. That's why the world got tariffs. That's why all these negotiations are happening. Starmer, Merz, Macron, they were told that they need to take their country's budget, buy US weapons, manufacture consent, pretending they're defending democracy, and create the type of environment to destroy Europe and vassalize Europe and UK into the BlackRock and the Blackstone and the networks. They took that job. And their job is to do it through whatever means necessary. And the more compromised they are, the better. And they get to do corrupt deals in the background, and they prefer corruption. Why do they prefer corruption? So that you're incentivized not to deviate from the power structure. And if anyone deviates from it, like JFK did in the US, or Trump may have in between the different elections, maybe, you know, he went in a different direction. Or how about Yasser Rabin, which was a leader in Israel that decided he wanted to work for normalization with Palestine, and that, you know, there was a better path and a better strategy that involved peace rather than continuing the flow of military-industrial complex profits. What do? They get assassinated. They get taken out. And then what do? They advertise again, and someone comes along and says, I'll take the job. This is the mafia network that runs this. You call it the deep state. Trump ain't taking on the deep state. Trump was subordinated into this power structure, which is why he's allowed to play president right now, because he's complying. Then eventually, rather than Yitzhak Rabin, you end up with someone like Netanyahu, who's psychopathic enough to do whatever it takes, or compromise enough to do whatever it takes. And so Israel, US, Qatar, they're all groomed, they're all weaponized, they all have military bases. And what do? They allow for a leadership in Gaza like Hamas to persist. And then they strategically can continue having the justification for firing the weapons, mowing the lawn, continually selling more weapons and justifying how the revenue still flows. They can manage their rise in power. They can take them out with military operations, but they want them to always persist. The more radicalized, the more extreme, the better, because that justifies the increase of the revenue and the cash keeps flowing. You can create a narrative at home that makes the American people kind of say, okay, well, we're evangelical Christians. We need to bring back the Messiah and we need to protect the Jews. And if you bless Israel, then you'll be blessed. So religion is weaponized in order to justify the military-industrial complex revenue. When you read the book by Paul Williams, Operation Gladio, it shows how the Vatican, the CIA, the Nazis, the terrorists, how they were all integrated into these drug trafficking, human trafficking, and weapons trafficking operations. Trump ain't coming after the drugs networks. The covert operations are all funded through these networks, and they're enforced and allowed to happen through governments. And so, America will always have covert operations with Iran, with Turkey, a different version with Saudi, a different version with UAE. There's no escaping from any of this stuff. You just have these different flavors of it. And because America is the global hegemon and the Soviet Union obviously fell, then you no longer have competing sides. And this is what happened after the 1991. And when America came off the gold standard and we went into that fiat currency standard that backed up the current proof of weapons network. And so, whenever the strategy shift or things go wrong, that creates a new manager that can just be wiped out or taken out. And so suddenly you get an announcement from Trump, yeah, we're doing some strategic strikes on ISIS, or we're taking out Qasem Soleimani or anything like that. Now, when they want to do it just by a strategic strike, they can. And yet when they want to level the whole of Gaza, oh, right, Hamas are in the tunnels and they're using everyone as human shields, and therefore we must blow up everything so we can take out all of the history, rebuild it, and build back better. And now we can go find the investors to build it as well. And we're shareholders in all the different companies that are going to benefit from this. And sometimes people need to be eliminated because they join, the faction of power that is not serving the function anymore. And so that's why you have these strategic strikes and different operations. That makes money. The manager gets to navigate, and they have to leverage wherever they can. So what have we seen with Netanyahu? He knows that when this war comes to an end, he faces the court cases, the ICJ cases, the internal corruption cases, and the fact that the military no longer needs him. So he needs to always make himself useful. And now now that the order has changed, he originally couldn't get Egypt to agree to the ethnic cleansing because Egypt started to defy. Why did Egypt start to defy? Because the IMF became less significant and China started to invest in Egypt. And China grew where many of the countries in the region were dependent upon China. And so you had reverse IMF, and through financial transactions, you had countries that were able to defy what they were originally installed to achieve. And so regions started to unify against Netanyahu. They started to co-opt the financial industrial complex. You had the Gulf sovereign wealth funds that were partnering in every single deal. You had what looked like Iran changing its role, changing its expansion of the proxy networks. And you started to witness a change in the region. Now, it's no accident that we had a weakening of Hezbollah, we had a weakening of Hamas, and Saudi is now weakening the Houthis in Yemen because Iran's no longer playing divide and conquer. And so when we moved to the 12-day war, it was pretty obvious that this was orchestrated in order to achieve a strategic narrative where America got to say they took out the nuclear program. Iran got to say we defended ourselves from the strikes, preemptive strikes from Israel. Israel got to take out IRGC hardliners that probably those in board with reform are okay with it. And Khamenei, in survival mode right now, is complying with the network. America needs to push up all of this narrative. Military makes more the more deep it gets. You get to do a currency war. You get to destroy the savings of the Iranian people. You get to have civil unrest. And in that civil unrest, you get to do a blackout. And in that blackout, maybe it's taking out the Mossad agents. Maybe some of the Mossad agents that weren't playing along were causing what happened in Operation Ajax, where MI6 and CIA were killing people and then blaming it on the leader. Maybe the IRGC, with an uprising against the military, is of course going to put that. What maybe people in the West were encouraging the Iranians to uprise, knowing that, or they just ignorant, that the only time a revolution happens is when the military and the people get to convert the military. So if you're asking the people to uprise against the military, of course they're going to get killed. And that's the lunacy and craziness. And across spaces, we have people engaging in propaganda, paid in order to push a narrative, make people think that this has got something to do with feminism and women's rights and peace and all that type of stuff. These are the covert operations that people may not even know that they're useful idiots to do. But what we're witnessing right now is the integration of every single proxy by the powers because all the powers have agreed. And narrative to make you think it's going to World War III. And that's why I can, with a degree of confidence, say that the fact that they are pitching this border peace, this is not the border peace. This is the outlet valve for what all the regional powers that have decolonized from the dollar have managed to negotiate with the financial industrial complex while they're trading regions that are going to be war zones because they need to give something to the military to have peace in their country. That's the empire. The dollar wasn't natural. It was the same thing that backed the pound. So anyway, I'm happy to see that despite how much it makes me want to puke, that after decades and decades of divide and conquer, manufactured forever wars, weaponization of religions, trying to create divide, conquer, that things changed just because China became a competing superpower. And now the US has to exit the region because it got vassalized into its own financial industrial complex, and the FIC has now turned against the people and its country, and the country is no longer sovereign. It created this monster. So US is now in energy independent, so we know that that changes the game. They're now an exporter of energy, so they're using the military to enforce energy exports on Ukraine, on Europe, on utilizing Venezuela to make up for some of the de-dollarization. Maybe they get tether penetration. Maybe they do currency wars where they destroy the savings of everyone in Latin and Central America to push their regional dollarization, while they sanction, so that confiscate some of the, like they did in Venezuela, some of the tether, so that no one else in the world uses it, so you can continue the weakening of the dollar. Maybe China and BRICS have actually become the primary energy purchaser, which is what's happening right now. And so don't you think that changes everything? Like, the people that still think Israel rule the world, do you think China wants a US destabilizing force for the US military to exist? No, they want integration. And China, who's propping up the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund, that's propping up with the financial industrial complex, will be using their leverage to dump Israel for the MiC and instead acquire it bit by bit by bit. And so you're going to see more and more debt in Israel. You're going to see the Palestine plan that requires the investment with regional stability. And you're going to see a model for what they want to export around the world on the technical side. And it's all dependent on national capital. And when you follow the money, you can see where this is going. Everyone else is going crazy, thinking that Israel's about to be the new empire with Pax Judaica that I was debating Professor Xian and various others on Spaces all the time. But everyone thought the ethnic cleansing would happen. I knew it wouldn't happen. It was meant to happen, but Netanyahu failed because Egypt aligned with the other forces and China started investing. So that's how you can do it with the sovereign wealth funds. This is why I focus on sovereign, you as an individual, you as your company. Because how do they get your company? They get it through Silicon Valley and taking your company public and bank debt. How do they get your country? By not allowing you to have a sovereign wealth fund, using a central bank that's a member of the Bank for International Settlements, currency wars, and covert operations. That's how they get the countries. How do you defend against it? Well, look at the lesson. They did it with sovereign wealth funds. Countries and companies are able to defend by utilizing the resources. And this is a psyop, and you can do that as an individual too. And this is the point that I'd like everyone to learn and why I'm going through this whole story. Basically, the FIC pitched the MiC and said, here's a model of how we can end the forever war and move to a new phase, and here's why we should do it. And guess what? It can happen. So suddenly, one by one, the GCC, it currently, originally, before this, it would always view Iran as a threat to regional stability. Israel was always viewed, has viewed Iran as a mixed revenue opportunity. So they never wanted to take out Iran, and they wanted Iran to expand its proxies, and they wanted to weaponize and make sure anti-Semitism persists so that they can fear people into joining the army. And then by having these radical groups that they recruit and manufacture, you radicalize the Jewish people to join the army and do ethnic cleansing, which is the job description that Netanyahu accepted. Now, what do? What's the narrative? They say that Saudi is a bootlicker to Israel. Now, Saudi did a deal with America, and they're trying to free themselves from the proxy Israel. And so that requires a degree of diplomacy. And Western media will frame it as this is just a proxy. Of course, they have to engage in joint operations because both of them saw Iran as a threat. It doesn't mean that one's a bootlicker for the other. We've got to have a bit more nuance in here. They both exist as independent players, and they both have, they both had vision. For the military-industrial complex, Israel wanted the Greater Israel Project. Saudi wanted to be a regional stability player in the region. Iran wanted to expand its proxies in order to become the hegemon in the region. And so you had this 3-player game that was perfect for the military-industrial complex, which is why the West would always fuel it and fuel any type of new powers that came along, new factions. So, you had this game where, the Gulf was aligned with FIC, Israel was aligned with MIC, and both of them had a common enemy because MIC was happy, but Israel had its own aspirations as well. And so everyone's trying to become the hegemon in the Middle East, and more divide and conquer is ushered through the control of the media as well. And meanwhile, people are just dying, and people are being told that they're just crazy people, and they fall further and further behind. And of course, people are radicalized in this process. What would you do if your wife was blown up, if your grandma was blown up, if your children were blown up? Wouldn't you buy into the recruitment of the people that say they're going to avenge, but at the top, they're serving greater powers, monetary power? Underneath, they're manufactured into an ideology that makes them think that they're serving a different type of mission to what they are. And so what did Saudi do eventually? Well, Saudi, would build its own networks, and you had these Wahhabi networks that led to ISIS and various other things, so that they could fight up against the proxies that were manufactured. Like, you see where this all goes. Religion is just being weaponized, and media is just weaponized, and everything you're seeing right now is still the same thing. And they pay influencers. And Elon is compromised into the network, executing regime change for greater power. Israel continually seeks to escalate with Iran, because that was the only way to justify Israel in the first place. It was the only way to justify making sure that more money was printed and more weapons were sold. And then they get the Greater Israel Project as a justification for creating these Palestinian laboratories and these Lebanese laboratories and these Yemenis laboratories, so that they can test more and more and more, and these West Bank laboratories. That makes them a good client. And that's what they need to do. And if the weapons stop selling, they need to come up with another model, as we said. So this is what we're witnessing right now. And I believe that GCC is now able to exert its dominance over the Middle East. And Israel is going to have to integrate. GCC are a good client to the financial industrial complex. They're getting them those deals. Iran's axis in Lebanon and all these other regions, that was how they got their influence. And this is what we've been seeing in the region. You weren't told that story because you didn't follow the money. You listened to the politicians and you listened to the media instead. And there's all levels of corruption. Like you're told, people think that this is just resistance. No, this is countries acting in their own self-interest and using proxies and using media in order to shift narrative. The whole thing is horrible. And it's what, it's what has been led to the death and destruction to back up the dollar, to gain access to resources. It's why you can have a situation, which I've covered in the past as well, where the leader of ISIS is the current Syrian president. Why? Because they're given a job mission. Originally, their job mission was to destabilize and create carnage in Syria. And they did that. And Iran resisted against it. And then Trump assassinated Qasem Soleimani, who was the Iran proxy that was creating the resistance group that were fighting against ISIS that create the whole destabilization. So now you can pay more. So Turkey and the GCC can hire the same group and say, let's rebrand a faction of them, call them HTS, and they can come in and they can stabilize Syria. And so now Turkey and the GCC can fund them to create a rebel movement. And what happened? Why was that so easy? Why did it lead to the overthrow of Assad? It's because all regional powers had agreed. Russia had agreed, Iran had agreed, Turkey had agreed. The US military has agreed that we're managing this transition. They would have negotiated how many weapon sales and how the demilitarization process will work. And they would also hedge it with the derivatives, and they'd have a partnership they'd have a different mission with Israel, and they'd say whichever mission succeeds is the one we'll go for. Israel didn't succeed. And, that's how these different types of operations work. This is the game. And you can read declassified documents, but it's when you follow the money that you can put it all together and figure out the whole thing. It also gives, by doing it via proxy, plausible deniability, so that when the genocide case comes along, you can say it was just them, so that it doesn't come back to suing the companies that were providing the weapons. That's why it's always done via these proxies as well. So, of course, the GCC doesn't want the Greater Israel Project like it's being portrayed in the media, and they're just bootlickers. And that's why people can't get it right, because they're following headlines and media and what politicians are saying. What does the Gulf country actually want for Israel? It wants it to be foreign direct investment. They want to acquire it. So they set up a game of good cop, bad cop. UAE joins Abraham Accords and normalizes with Israel. They look like the bad cop. They're the demons, right? They're also doing the Muslim Brotherhood side. So Muslim Brotherhood makes it look like they're not the Muslim ones. But meanwhile, they're giving more power to their sovereign wealth fund as all the millionaires and billionaires leave the UK and go over to Dubai. And so UAE just looks like a complete traitor. But UAE is going to be acquiring Israel in the end, because they're in Abraham Accords and they can acquire the assets. The war, the 12-day war, makes them more distressed. The stock market goes up, the economy gets worse, the debt is burdened onto the people. That's the same thing that's happening in UK. That's the same thing that's happening in America. That's the same thing that's happening in Europe. That's the same thing that's happening in Israel, because it's being manufactured in order to happen that way. Saudi, they get to look like good cop. They're the ones that saying, I'm not going to normalize with Israel, and I'm going to prevent any wars happening. I'm going to have to work with the US when I have to work with the US. But now, because China's more important, I'm going to be normalizing with Iran, and we're going to be coordinating on how we reach regional stability. Iran plays the anti-Israel role. The proxies are radicalized into thinking they are resisting, but really it's serving imperial powers. Previously, it was done in Afghanistan between Russia, the Soviet Union, and America, but now it's being done between America and China. But China wants regional stability, and America has been co-opted into regional stability by negotiating with the FIC as well. None of it was really, I don't think, I can't place judgment on this, but this is what countries do when acting in their own self-interest. Were any of them doing it for Palestine? Probably not. It's a convenient thing to happen. But that illegal occupation created the narrative to continually justify everything that needed to happen next. But that led to Israel being exposed as an apartheid state. And so the job description was put out. For decades, basically, Iran's strategy was to have the proxy networks, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Iraq side, and the Houthis in Yemen, and then be able to leverage that to negotiate a better transaction. And then eventually they won't be backed by weapons and funding. And once the money dries up, the ideology either integrates or is no longer useful. Basically, the Axis projected Iranian power. And that's just a reality. That's a survival mechanism. But the divide and conquer is ending right now. And so Iran's actions always push Israel's actions and the US actions towards escalation. But really, what was the threat of that? They knew that it was essentially a winner-takes-all mission, because they could end up allowing Israel to have the justification to create the Greater Israel Project and become the predominant hegemon. The GCC doesn't want that. So this is the interesting dynamics. They don't want, they want Israel to just be a normal player in the region, be strategically weakened and acquired. And so what happens next? The GCC can partner with Iran. And that's what's happening right now. The GCC doesn't want the Greater Israel Project. Iran doesn't want the Greater Israel Project. None of the... and the GCC don't want Iranian supremacy either. And so you end up with the practicality. So where people think, all right, Hezbollah are going to come back, Hamas are going to come back, Iran won't sell out. This is practicality. This is reality. Now, what happened with the sanctions? It vassalized Iran into China. So 90% of the oil in Iran is purchased by China. Do you think China wants Israel to be a force for US military power? Of course it doesn't. So now the role has changed, and we have to change it based upon following the money. And that's the reality of where we are right now. And this is what I want people to understand, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to figure out what might be happening next. Now, as we speak right now, we're being told that there's a military buildup in Iran, or US is deploying, USS Abraham, big ginormous warships and stuff like that. Do we really think that when the GCC don't want the war, when Israel has now essentially become a paid for rent to eliminate the Hezbollah hardliners and build back better for the financial industrial complex, and Iran is not reacting to that, could it just be that everything we're seeing is theater again? Well, I'm pretty sure we are. I'm pretty sure that that's what's happening. And I'm pretty sure that this is not America growing or showing strength. This is the full vassalization of America into the FIC and a new world order being set. And that's why I think the border peace is a significant event. That's why I'm not happy with what's actually happening. This is not what I'd advocate for. But after the 2 years that we've watched and everything that we've seen, I'm happy that this is coming to an end, and this is actually going to be something. There's no justice. Don't think the Palestinians are going to own their land. But how else could this have been stopped? Everyone else was saying, go to war, escalate, go further, become more aggressive. That's what they wanted. That's what the MIC wanted. And that's the reality today. So I believe what is happening right now is that Iran, for regime survival, vassalized into dependency upon China, is giving some of its ideological side. It's basically about survival right now, and that makes sense. That's not a sellout, as people will frame it. Some people will frame it. People like to use these stupid words because they can't get through the nuance as well. So anyway, I believe everyone's on the same team at this stage right now. There is a slight nuance in there, which is that there are negotiations, and Israel used to give power to MIC, but now we need to get rid of these weapons. So maybe the next theater is by having a back and forth, another back and forth between Iran and Israel, all of the weapons go. Then you enter into de-weaponization, maybe denuclearization. I don't know exactly what the plan is, but I know that it's not what people think it is. And it's all because of China and BRICS diplomacy, which were aligned with the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, and them all working together as a team to end divide and conquer. And now there is no need for proxies. So proxies can integrate or be eliminated. And I believe that that's what we're witnessing. And maybe there's been some escalation right now. Hezbollah leadership were taken out, all the different things. Assad was taken out, and he wasn't taken out. He was put to Russia because Russia agreed. Everybody agreed. Now, this is what I think people need to understand. We are not witnessing chaos. We are witnessing coordination on a scale that we've never seen before. And there needs to be some kind of off ramps, because people need to maintain their narrative as these things happen. And that's what I think we'll get another version of the 12-day war, as I said before. And I think during that blackout, I think the people that were taken out, plus some aggression, but please don't be a useful idiot for telling average Iranian people to come up against the military, because you will be sending someone to their grave in that scenario, because there's bigger operations that are happening here. And there's different factions of power that may not be on board the mission that need to be eliminated in order to get to this board of peace outcome that we're going to see in the end. Okay. So, what is the board of peace? I wrote some notes on it. Let me see if I can get there. At the final part as well. Right. That's why I believe that October the 7th was allowed to happen. That's why when you go to my blog on SimonDixon.com and type in atrocity, you'll see all the manufactured lies and how the media was weaponized. Violence does happen, but it happened for a reason, because it was allowed to happen. And we know that Hannibal Directive was deployed, and Apache helicopters, Israeli IDF Apache helicopters did kill their own people. We know that because the war minister admitted it and said that it happened. And so if you're still pushing those narratives, and we know that there were lies about 40 beheaded babies, understand that that happened because it was meant to happen, because Israel and the US MiC are doing what they always do. And they're willing to do it on their own people, which is why they're willing to do that on their own people in the civil unrest campaigns at home right now. I'm not saying it's going to get that bad. You won't go through 99% of what the rest of the world went through. You'll get 1% of it, but people are freaking out around the 1% at the moment as well. And so the job description was failed, and Netanyahu has changed his role. Right. So what is Trump's board of peace? Given the background and the history and everything I wanted to go, and I know these are long videos, but I create AI summaries. If you didn't notice, if you didn't get to watch any of my long form content, we create blogs. I put the long form content, and then we do an AI summary underneath so that you can get a TLDR and a shorter one. I like to do all the detail so that we've documented this, so I can feed it into the AI, and I can also have this documentation of what's happening in real time. And we're building our own, sort of decentralized infrastructure, running our own LLMs in case these get censored out. That's the resistance, by the way. We build back by owning our assets in self-custody, by boycotting the networks, by running our own LLMs in decentralized structures. So what is the board of peace? The board of peace is essentially the negotiations of America's own retreat from a unipolar power. And it needs to be framed as strength while it's retreating into a regional power. It's got nothing to do with peace. Peace is like a side impact of what's already been negotiated, because the MiC is allowing for peace. And this is essentially the US shedding its commitments and its costly commitments and its propping up of its proxies while maintaining the appearance of strength and looking good. And so a peace board, essentially, it gives, it kind of gives some noble face to this mission while they're building back better based upon the war zones that they effectively created. The real fact is that the FIC essentially traded the stability, and this is just the narrative as a result of it, because capital flows are going to be restructured. And when the FIC want to restructure, just like they're doing in Syria right now, they like to create a bit of carnage so that everyone else is negotiating on bad terms, but they get the best terms. And so that model will be followed in every war zone. In order to get leverage, they take their proxies and they give the ability to get the best terms, and then they can manage their liquidity accordingly, and that will all be done via the border peace. And the border peace will be profiting from every single rebuild better program, and they will be selling it to investors. And Jared Kushner will be pretending that people are doing it out of the goodness of their heart. Nothing they say is real. Everything is a lie. Everything is narrative. But we're entering into a world where effectively, for the very first time in our lifetime, in our generation's lifetime, the MIC, the military industrial complex, is going to be taking a backdoor step. And so why do you think Trump came out and said we need to invest $1.5 trillion? And why do you think he cartelled the bonuses? Because he needs them to innovate into artificial intelligence and cybersecurity and space warfare and everything that Elon Musk said that they should be doing in order to put go up to the moon and win the space wars and the next Cold Wars that they'll manufacture the narrative of, that they need to win space and then they need to win Mars. And so, the military is going for the less profitable model. So now, more money needs to be printed, and more debt needs to be created, and they need to roll over the national debt in order to spend more. The profit share center is essentially moving from conflict to post-conflict reconstruction. It's the Build Back Better business model, and instead of weaponizing proxies, they're doing arms maintenance contracts, and they'll actually have a security architecture that deals with regional partners, and the countries will be negotiating, build your data centers here because we don't want a dependency upon you. And so the data centers are being built in the regions where the sovereign wealth funds have negotiation power. It's basically a legitimacy room and a bunch of people that are going to profit from everything. A place where you get to kind of wrap it up in a noble cause, and everyone that's already negotiated their deals, they get an off-ramp. They can go and say, oh, the only reason we negotiated peace is because Trump forced it on us. And Trump gets to look like he's creating world peace when all the breakthroughs have already happened through all the regional powers already. Anyone that needs to hedge, like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Russia, Turkey, they can now simply say, all right, it was Trump exerting his leverage through the border peace. And now you got an off-ramp to get to what has already been negotiated. Now, I don't think Ukraine-Russia ends anytime soon, but you have a mechanism for when all the profits are dried up, when all the money is printed over the next 3 years during the Trump administration. You get to squeeze everything you can and then say, yeah, it was Trump applying pressure. And so you needed theatrical things like what happened in Venezuela and what's about to happen in Greenland in order to project the power when the reality is the empire is shrinking. The FIC is weakening the dollar, and the MIC is exiting all of those regions and negotiating as much as they can. And it's the technology that's being used in order to build the data centers, and everyone is flipping the whole world upside down in order to get that energy together. And that's what we covered in part 1 in the technology side. So everyone thinks that the US has become stronger by taking out Venezuela, by taking out Greenland. They'll also have their part of Ukraine. And really, it is regional. And that changes. This marks the US downsizing, and this marks the multipolar world order. And the linchpin of it is by having the security forces in Gaza that officially ends the Greater Israel Project. That will then lead to a flurry of similar deals in Sudan, in Libya, in Lebanon, the whole region, North Africa, MENA, and because that is the exit. And I, quite frankly, am looking forward to seeing that so that everyone can see how this actually happened. And I wanted to document how these things actually worked, because you're going to be fed a very different story of what's actually happening here. But anyway, it allows for all this peace to be packaged up as diplomacy. It gives everyone the good feelings, but the withdrawals are going to happen because the military is taking a step back and they have been given other things to do. And that's what the border peace is. Trump will continue to perfectly extract for the financial industrial complex as he has all along. And that means that America will be further and further vassalized into this power structure through the K-shaped economy, as will Europe, as will the West, as will everything that we've been covering. And I personally believe that there'll be massive knock-on effects. I think the Middle East being able to unify around its own energy with manufacturing base in China and purchasing US innovation is going to create one of the highest growth areas. Now, imagine all the people that migrated away from a war zone, ended up in the West, and when their country was about to grow, they stayed in the West when the MIC was coming home and manufacturing civil unrest in the West. That's the type of sickness that happens here. So make it a win-win deal. Many people in the West don't want the migrants, the growth sectors happening at home. Don't get fooled. Don't go for a double whammy. Don't come to the West when the West is being colonized by itself in the financial industrial complex. And I think everyone's happy with that deal. Now, when you've got peace in the Middle East, and that leads to North Africa and the MENA region being able to rebuild under these new reconstruction models, the finance companies are incentivized. You're going to get a lot of the resources that are needed for all of this AI and robotics and data centers. But what happens to Africa and other regions? Well, I think that the global South in general, across Asia and Africa, will continue the Belt and Road Initiative because it's now allowed to. And I think that China, Russia, America, MICTIC, all of the powers, Iran, Turkey, all of them, have all agreed on what regions are going to be split. I think the MIC said that they'll get Europe and Latin America. And so what do? We enter the World Economic Forum. And everything that we've been preparing people by following the money rather than listening to the media is being really conclusively communicated through riddles and lies in the World Economic Forum. So now I'm going to conclude everything that we put together here. And thank you all for staying this long. And hopefully the AI summaries will break it down for you. But I would officially like to welcome you with the board of peace to the multipolar world order. This is not theory anymore. It is a reality. US artificial intelligence will power the Western Hemisphere, and more energy in every form possible. Whatever needs to happen will usher in that 1984 Orwellian nightmare stablecoin standard integrated into social credit scores, artificial intelligence, and you fight back with decentralized artificial intelligence. They need energy. They need rare earth minerals. They need chips. They need commodities. And every single area will adjust to the reality of the AI arms race. That is the narrative that's being pushed. Even the Federal Reserve monetary policy might be given to BlackRock just to make sure that it goes into capital rather than any type of conservatism. The entire West will be asset stripped for fictic Mick. And Norway's sovereign wealth funds and the financial industry, the FIC, will basically asset strip Europe. That will lead that operation. I think Venezuela will be dollarized through stable coins, but regionally, more currency warfare across Latin America in order to have regional dollarization. And then they'll be vassalized into US to provide all those resources. The people won't get any help there. Ukraine will eventually be negotiated. I think there's more to go. I don't think it's happening anytime soon. Split between the FIC and Russia. Russia is going to be hedging between India and China to make sure that this can continue. And the MIC will sacrifice as many Ukrainians for as long as they can get this narrative to continue. And Russians will be sacrificed as well. Don't believe any of the hype. And what did we see this week? We saw the most likely problem will be between the two Indo-China powers. Half the world's, 3 billion people over between Indo and China. So how did the Gulf countries and other powers make an environment that makes all of that work? Well, you saw that there was a theatrical war or escalation between UAE and Saudi. I covered this one last week. Saudi ended up controlling Yemen, which I believe UAE had agreed to. UAE ended up getting its port in Somaliland to control the Red Sea. Turkey ended up getting its resources in Somalia and its port in the Red Sea. And UAE, Saudi, and Turkey, and Iran eventually, as it goes into the Strait of Hormuz, which I believe in this upcoming operation, Khamenei will stay because he's cooperating in what you get next. They've all figured out the ports and the routes. And now America can slowly exit into these negotiations and give the FIC as much as it wants. And those bases become less and less important for destabilization campaigns. And so to keep India and China aligned, what happened next? Well, we saw that a pact was signed between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan. Pakistan, a military power to compete with Israel's nuclear. Pakistan also a nuclear. And Turkey, a very capable NATO army with Saudi Arabia. And likely Egypt will join that, another very capable militarized force. Who's Pakistan enemy that Trump claims that he negotiated peace with, which was more likely China, because China has resources in Pakistan and China has rivalries with India, but also Russia was providing many of those weapons and India was building their own manufacturing base. So BRICS is what unified that, Russia, China, India. But of course, Trump was trying to get the Nobel Peace Prize, which instead went to Machado Maria in Venezuela because she was meant to be a part of the regime change. Something may have gone wrong there. We'll see. But in response, UAE normalized with India, another nuclear power. So now you got Israel's nukes, you got UAE normalized with India, with a security pact, and you got Saudi and Turkey security pact with Pakistan. And most of these countries are on the border peace. So it's pretty nice. It seems to work quite well for me. Anyone still think that Al-Aqsa Mosque is going to make Israel the superpower of the world? That's why in that debate I said, I don't think that's going to happen. And if it does, it means my analysis is wrong, or there's something that I haven't seen, because that would just destabilize the region. Maybe it's a part of the plan, maybe not. I'll keep reviewing and I'll cover every single week anyway. But now the shipping routes have been handed over. The foundation to protect them by the region is happening. And America gets its own routes with the Greenland, the Ukraine, and the Venezuelan axis. And there's the nuclearization that can allow such a thing to happen. Chinese AI will likely go renewable with all of their solar panels that Elon was talking about. There may be a narrative to spend more of that $1.5 trillion around space wars, the next civil war that they'll create, maybe between Russia and America, that will justify it. All of that renewable energy will be deployed that Elon was talking about. Gulf energy will be deployed. Russian energy will be deployed as well. Iran will be vassalized into China, and then normalization will eventually happen between the GCC, I believe, and those port routes for Iran's gas pipelines that we talked about as well. And that is how you get to, they can make up for the sanctions through the BRICS corridors as well. And this was all the results. This is why competition is good. This is why multipolarity is good. Now, when there's no world reserve currency, what tends to help people? Well, people that can hold Bitcoin in self-custody. People that can, central banks are using gold. We know the problems and the limitations of gold. Silver's become industrial commodity. But commodities is why commodities are going crazy right now. But in multipolarity, there's only one global digital currency that has diversified hash power based upon energy upon all the regional players that are mining, and that's Bitcoin. Nothing else competes with that. The crypto scam is part of the surveillance state. That's the programmable money, PSYOP. Bitcoin was a gateway drug into central bank digital currencies and stablecoins. But the elites, they won't. What happened in Clarity Act? Self-custody was fine while they built the surveillance state with crypto. Why? Because the elites want the exit as well. So they're trying to centralize as much Bitcoin as possible right now through nodes like Strategy, Borrow Against Your Bitcoin, Cantor Fitzgerald, Larry Fink, ETF, Van Eyck, all of these, Morgan Stanley, different trading platforms. They're trying to get as much Bitcoin so that you can lever it up so that they can have it. But you still get the Bitcoin in self-custody. And what's the beauty of the Bitcoin in self-custody? You get to boycott the Federal Reserve. By owning it in self-custody, you get to boycott BlackRock. And by not borrowing against it, you get to boycott the banks. And by not investing it in the S&P, you get to boycott this network of degeneracy that props up the proof of weapons network that's backed by all the violence that hopefully we're going to move to a more peaceful world right now for some. And I think the Belt and Road Initiative will build up certain countries, and China will eventually get predator, and we go through the whole cycle, predatory. But we are in the arms race. That artificial intelligence through both China and America and data centers located globally is going to suck up all the energy and all the commodities, and it is going to create mass unemployment, and everyone needs to be prepared for that. People need to know what is their strategy. You need to be building your community. Maybe you don't want to be in cities. Maybe you want to be more rural. Maybe you want to live in different countries that are going to benefit from multipolarity rather than the country that's not. Not everyone will be able to move. Not everyone's in that financial position, but maybe you can make the moves you need to make within your jurisdiction or your country. Because the military-industrial complex has a new role. We saw it in Venezuela. It is a militia rental military, the most powerful military. China will become more powerful, I forecast on this eventually. But it is working for transnational capital. It's not working for American national security. And because of these deals, there will be no World War III. Stop listening to people that are saying this is World War III. But there will be civil unrest, and they will bring in the surveillance state as the problem reaction solution. And there will be more and more false flags or manufactured violence that are real in order to do that. Because remember, the MIC doesn't care. And that is going to be rolled out globally. And there's going to be sovereign people and there's going to be everyone else. And that's why you need to focus on sovereign, because that's the story that we learn from all of this stuff. So protect yourself by building sovereign wealth. Boycott what you need to boycott. You'll never get this perfect. I still need to use AI and an iPhone, and I know what's behind it. But just commit to getting better every single day. And that's what we can do. I had a little podcast that's going to be coming out recently as well. I did an interview with Jeff Booth, and we were going through how black-pilled I am, but I'm trying to get people reality, because when a storm is coming, you don't want to pretend through positivity that the storm isn't coming. You want to know that it's coming so that you can get your raincoat, you can get your umbrella, you can fix the roof, and you can get everything set up to weather the storm. But the politicians and the media don't want you to know that it's happening while it's happening. And so I want to give you the black pill reality. And he was telling me about how you have to focus on the positive and the white pill. But I think it's this yin and yang that we need to get right here. Because you do need to focus on solutions, but solutions focused on praying that the storm doesn't come ain't going to fix it. And that's the reality right now. So I hope you enjoy. It's going to be coming out. I'll upload it to my YouTube channel. Make sure you're subscribed to my YouTube channel, because I'm putting lots of interviews up there. We're also going to be breaking down all of these and uploading it to the podcasts on Spotify and Apple. I also, in case this language gets me taken off YouTube, or I'm building my social credit score that gets me taken off, I'll also build my Rumble score and back it up there and stream this to X. So follow me on X. That's where I do most of the real-time analysis. Follow me on Rumble so that there's a backup. And you can sign up at SimonDixon.com completely free, nothing to sell, because there's a membership portal where we back up as much as we can in case I get taken down, and we're trying to build some kind of more decentralized infrastructure that makes me more resistant to any kind of shadow banning or censorship that may happen as a result. But I get a sneaky suspicion right now that they're giving us freedom of speech, but not freedom of reach, so that we talk and we build our score. It's not perfect. It's not ideal. We're going to share this journey together. And it's all because you need to have community. So take care of yourself, take care of your family, and look around you. Get to know your neighbors, decide where you're going to live, start preparing for what comes ahead. Nothing stops this train. Always remember, you're alive at one of the most crazy and interesting times in financial history. Most are sadly going to get wrecked because they won't prepare. Others are going to do really well. I want you to be on the right side of this change. I'm hoping that if you take some of these steps and follow the money instead of following the media, you might be able to be one of those people that transitions with peace, love, and unity, rather than the people that are going to be useful idiots to manufacture civil unrest. And we're going to need a community of people that are sovereign and, have become effectively the people that are able to prepare people for this. So if you enjoy any of this content, keep sharing it, share it with people. If you need the shorter form, make sure you keep an eye on my blog and my YouTube channel, and we'll keep launching the shorter form versions, as well as those like me that want all the details so that you can master this subject, so that you can be more prepared for what happens next. And think of it like this. Many people have said in the comments, and I'd love to hear your comments, that once they understand this, they don't listen to any of the other propaganda. They can't even listen to other podcasts because they know they're serving a sponsorship, monetization, divide and conquer, radicalism agenda, whatever it may be. And they're all just prostitutes for whatever money they need. I was blessed that I don't need money because Bitcoin looked after me, because I believe there is a spiritual element and energy that comes with money that isn't used, that doesn't, once you find this stuff out, I think we have a duty to allocate our money to tap into that spiritual energy. There will always be this evil, this yin and yang. Without evil, you can't know good. And we'll keep sharing this journey together. So I will see you this time next week. That's everything from the World Economic Forum, retranslating the speeches, and then leaving you with actual actions that you can take and prepare so that you're not falling for the lies in the future. I'll see you for another episode of Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live, this time next week. Peace.